Today I'm speaking with Emilie Paige Dye. Emilie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before I do your bio, I did just want to mention to the viewers that we're going to be touching on some topics that will not be appropriate for small children. So if you have little ones around, please save this interview for another time. Having said that, I'll get into your bio here. Emilie is from Washington State, but currently lives all the way over in Sydney, Australia. So we're doing a time zone difference here. I appreciate, by the way, you working with me on the time zone difference. During high school, she attended Logos School and Christchurch in Moscow, Idaho, run by Doug Wilson, which will be a big part of what we talk about today. She was graduated from George Washington University with a Bachelor of Science in Economics before moving to Australia. She is a writer, political commentator, libertarian thinker, as well as a research and marketing analyst for an evidence-based research think tank. Her opinion pieces have appeared in many worldwide newspapers, and she has appeared on multiple TV news programs, as well as radio programs across Australia. Having said that, Emilie, tell us more about yourself.
Yeah, I'm the awkward one with the accent here in Australia, which is quite fun. Yeah, I came here about 5 years ago and decided that I was done with snow, and it's been pretty good.
Do, do people ever ask you like why you don't have an accent, and yet you work with the Australian government sometimes?
Oh yeah, I get made fun of for my accent. And in Australia they call Americans seppos because yank rhymes with septic tank, and shortening of septic tank is seppo. And so that is the slur for Americans in Australia. And they're like, hey,
Mm,
seppo.
that's awful. It's like a Cockney rhyming slang on steroids.
Yeah.
Uh, and
Yeah,
if
but
you
the
could,
only accent, the only way I can hit the accent in Australia, like the Australian accent, is by cussing. So I won't demonstrate my Australian.
could I ask what's your favorite part about Sydney?
Um, Probably the weather and the people. And it's just a safe city. I can go for a run by myself in a dark park at 10 o'clock at night and never feel the least threat or concern whatsoever.
Hmm,
And it's great.
that's awesome. I got to Sydney once. I was back when I was a Christian. I was on a missions trip with New Tribes Mission to New Guinea, and so we went to Sydney and then up to New Guinea for a few weeks. But it's for that 24 hours I was there. It seemed like a beautiful place. I was lucky to finally see the opera house and so forth. But I'd love to actually like spend time there. It seems like a cool place. And if you could, before we get into your story, tell us something completely fun or quirky or one of your hobbies.
One of my hobbies. Well, I ride horses on the weekends. That was something I did all through my childhood and still do here in Sydney. So I drive out of the city and go and jump ponies.
That's awesome. Very cool. I'm jealous.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, we're here, of course, to hear your story. We are going to be kind of doing it a little bit differently. We're going to talk about your journey through Christianity and back out of it. We're also going to be taking a little detour, of course, to talk a lot about the situation that happened with Christchurch and Logo School. But if you could, before you get into the Moscow situation, could you tell us just very generically, start with how did you get exposed to Christianity? What were your earliest memories of your time, with the Bible and with Jesus?
Yeah, I would have been pretty young, probably like 5 or 6, and my parents converted to evangelical Christianity. I think my earliest memories of that was we weren't allowed to celebrate Halloween anymore, which was quite devastating, um, because it was a satanic holiday, obviously, and so children couldn't dress up and get candy. So all my friends were trick or treating and dressing up. I was stuck in normal clothes and
Mm.
without candy, and that was probably
That's
so that
that's
was my introduction into it.
that's trauma right there.
Yeah, right there. So I think at first that was my general perception, was just missing out and not getting to do the same things that the other kids did. But then my parents really pushed it out, like we're holier than thou. And it became a bit of a weird like ego complex as a kid. It's like, oh, but I'm going to heaven because I'm not eating the candy on Halloween. Um,
That's amazing. We my
yeah.
family my family went back and forth like a ping pong table on that topic of is it too demonic to be involved in, and can you sanctify it enough? But it's crazy the hoops we had to jump through.
You have to dress up as like biblical characters or something.
We probably did at some point, yeah. And I think they redeemed it by calling it a harvest festival or something like that.
Yes.
Crazy. And so, in terms of though the actual gospel itself, like when did you first hear about Jesus dying for your sins on the cross?
That probably would have been again in those very early years. I went to lots of like the Bible summer camps, and so I heard the gospel there. I think I prayed the sinner's prayer every single summer at summer camp. Um, just because at that point, I was very scared of going to hell and not being good enough. And I had all of the oldest child syndrome of wanting to be perfect, wanting to please my parents. And that also turned into wanting to be the perfect Christian. And so I was really, really into it, really devout, really scared of hell. My parents had started a Bible study some point in my elementary years, probably like fourth or fifth grade, studying Revelation. And so it was all of the end time stuff. And I was terrified of the rapture. So I was constantly praying the sinner's prayer, praying for repentance. I was afraid that I wasn't good enough. That was my general childhood perception of Christianity.
With the end times there, did you have the sense that they were thinking that the rapture was actually going to take place in any moment? Or I know with the Calvinist perspective and the Reform perspective, it gets into post-millennial view, like were they just like Christ is coming back any moment now, or how did that theology play out?
It was imminent. It was, yeah, the idea that could happen at any time.
Okay.
Always waiting. My dad really loved reading about the rapture. And I still remember like at one point, like my parents had gone for a walk or something. And so the cars were still in the driveway. And my sisters had also like gone off somewhere. And so I didn't know where they were. And I had like come back from the horse barn and everyone was gone, and I was sure the rapture had happened. And I had like this moment of panic for about half an hour, for freaking out, thinking that I'd been left behind.
Mm.
Um,
You're not the first person that's told me that. That's really crazy. But I mean, it's funny to laugh at looking back at it. But at the time, I'm sure that was hyper traumatic to think through that, and just or once it's settled to think that still, even though it wasn't that exact incident, that it could have been the next day that Christ came back. And did you feel like there was a sense though of when you began to really understand the gospel more and more that you just knew you were safe in the arms of Jesus, that there was no way you were going to be left behind?
I think to some extent, but I mostly started rejecting that theology, is where I came in. It would have been in my high school years where,
Gotcha.
well, he hasn't come back for thousands of years. Maybe we got this wrong. And so I started getting more into that Calvinist theology of the post-millennialism and was like, I'm not sure about it. And so was less afraid because of that. It felt like less of a certainty. I put away my go bag that I had packed for the rapture just in case.
Mm. That's funny.
And yeah.
I just interviewed the son of the main character from the movie A Thief in the Night. You heard of that movie?
Oh, wow.
Like
Yes.
the main character, his son has deconverted and came on, but it's interesting to kind of see it coming full circle now. And in terms of the actual gospel, what age were you when you professed your faith in Christ?
I would have been young, probably around 10,
Okay,
but
gotcha.
I don't remember an exact time. So that kind of was an insecurity for me because I felt
Mm,
like everyone else had this story and this immediate moment. And I just believed it because my parents believed it. And there wasn't like a specific instant. So I was like checking my bases and praying the sinner's prayer many times.
yeah, just to be sure. There's so much at stake, especially you. I assume you believed in a literal fiery hell.
Yes, I did.
Mm.
Very much so.
When you were professing your faith at Christ, for sure at age 10 and beyond, what was it like with your personal relationship with Christ? Like, did you feel like you were increasing in your desire to be holy, your desire to be a witness to people, to make a difference, as it were, for the kingdom, and to grow in your love for the Lord and your understanding of His love for you?
Yeah, I very much I wanted to be a good Christian. I wanted to live that life. I wanted to please God. I wanted to please Jesus.
Mm.
I read the Bible many, many times. I think I was always very anxious and very uncomfortable about trying to tell people about my faith. But there was one point I remember as I would have been probably in seventh grade, so 14 maybe, that we'd picked up this homeless woman on the side of the road, and it was a cold night. Why is this woman out like walking down the street? And it was between two major, like two towns. So she was in the middle of nowhere, probably had another 10 miles to go to the nearest town. And so she was just like stuck, and it was a really cold night. So we picked her up. And we're like, "What are you doing? Are you okay?" And she's like, "Oh, I just was trying to get to the next place and ended up stuck in the wilderness," essentially. So we took her
Mm.
home, um, gave her a bath, gave her a dinner, and let her spend the night that night. And I remember that night just feeling so convicted that I had to tell her about the gospel and tell her about Jesus. And so I ended up giving her my Bible. I like packed a lunch for her the next day when I was packing my sister's lunches for school. And in her lunch, I packed like a bunch of extra food and a Bible, and sent her off on her way with the Bible, and feeling like, yeah, now I've shared the gospel. I didn't have to say anything, but I gave her the Bible with all my notes in it. Um,
It's funny you say that because I often wondered over the years, like that pressure that we put on people to be a good witness for the Lord, not just in terms of living for Him, but also sharing the gospel. That there's so many personality things that come into play, and for people that are really shy. I mean, this was not part of my deconversion. I just noticed it even as a Christian, as a young person, noticing we're putting pressure on people to share the gospel, and some people really are so introverted that that's a really difficult thing. And we're like praising the of course the preacher and the missionary, the street preacher, but it's part of their personality. They love to get up and project their voice and get on a soapbox and do it, or whatever, a paintboard, and do their preaching. But it's like, yeah, we can kind of praise them because they're doing the Lord's work, but we shouldn't be like looking down the people that, little grandma that doesn't want to talk to anybody because she's just so shy, but she's just kind of living this quiet, peaceable life, as you might say, where she's a quiet example of the Lord and of Christ and of what grace means. But we're kind of like saying she's not really doing the most important work, which is actually preaching it. And that definitely irked me a lot as I was growing up. I never didn't really put the pieces together as to, what was going on behind the scenes, of course. But when you were in churches, did worship and time with, whether it was youth group worship or the larger church worship, did you feel like you were communing with God, and did you feel like you could sense His presence, either that He was there with you or talking to you, and not necessarily audibly, but just that He was, speaking to you in the sense of saying, "I'm here. I've got a plan for you. I'm doing things in your life. And when you're wounded, I'm here to comfort you. When you're scared, I'm here to assist you." Did you feel like Jesus and the Spirit were kind of moving in your heart through all those years?
yeah, there was a period where I was at this somewhat charismatic church, and during that period, I loved it. I
Mm,
loved Christianity. I was all about Jesus. I would get into the music, and I never spoke in tongues. And so I was a little insecure because I wasn't able to speak in tongues. But I was like, they had a banjo, and it was like you could just feel the Spirit moving, and people were speaking in tongues, and there was like this huge experience around it. And
mm,
at that point, I felt really close to God. And I think that would probably be the period in my life where I had the least like insecurity about being saved. And that would have been in those like teenage years or early teens.
mm.
Um, and yeah, still elementary school, probably. So I was absolutely, yeah, infatuated with the idea of the gospel and of Jesus. I'd say as far as like God speaking directly to me, the memory of that, giving the woman the Bible, was probably the point where I was like, I've heard the voice of God. Like I had to do it because God told me specifically.
Mm.
Uh, I'm sure there were other moments where I felt that as well, but that was the most memorable and clear moment of God is speaking to me and telling me to do this thing.
Mm. And so your family, I assume, was really doing things to live for the Lord and to do family devotions and getting you plugged into church quite a bit.
Yeah, we had a weekly Bible study at our house, and we went to church most Sundays. They, my parents were a bit like, they were very busy. They were farmers, so they could get a bit distractible, and we were always late to everything. And so we were often late to church. But when we were going to that charismatic church, that was when we were the most like there on time. It was also one of those churches where there were kids my age, which was so nice. A lot of the time, because I lived in such a tiny town, the churches we ended up going to didn't have kids my age, and my parents got into like very niche theological, like they were very into getting the correct theology. And because of that, we ended up in churches that didn't like that often weren't the ones with other children or as lively. They didn't want, yeah.
Did that drive towards theological accuracy? Did that end up kind of being a self-alienating thing where like you find the church that's kind of close to your theology, but then you find, oh, they've got this, whatever, they're not Paedo Baptists, whatever, and we're Paedo Baptists, so we're switching, and then, oh, they're this, but they're not quite, post millennialist enough. Was it hard to find a niche and to feel like there was a home church, where like were you constantly shifting to find a more pure church?
Yeah, we were constantly shifting. The first time that happened, we were at the Methodist church, and they hired a female pastor, and my parents were like, no, women can't be pastors, absolutely not. And so left that church. And that was another of those churches that I'd felt pretty connected in with. And yeah, there was a good Bible study there, a good like youth Bible study. And I again loved it. I haven't thought about that in a while. Um, and so it was very into like dissecting the Bible and dissecting passages. And so got a lot of my early learnings about Christianity at that church, but then female pastor, so we couldn't be there anymore. So then we ended up at the charismatic church, which was great for a while. And then there was some sort of split. I don't remember what the split was about in church, but it split. And then we ended up in a home church, and we were there for a while, but they got too charismatic for my family. Like people were doing like the fainting and falling over on the floor thing and the wailing and crying. And I was too reserved for that. I didn't feel comfortable with that. So I never spoke in tongues. I never did the like crying and like wailing in the church. And I was very weirded out by it. And my dad was like, nah, we're done with that. And we finally ended up then at this flour mill church, which was primarily very elderly people. And yeah, lovely people, but I think 60 would have been young. And
That's awesome.
yeah.
As in like this church is just dying out literally.
Yes, quite literally.
It's crazy. In terms of your story with how it relates to Moscow, at what age did you all get involved with Moscow, Idaho, and how I got the sense from some of what I read in your story that even when you went there, you weren't necessarily living close by. Is that correct? And like, how did that whole story start?
Yeah, we lived in a really small town called Pomeroy, Washington, which would have been, I forget how far exactly. It's about an hour and a half drive to Moscow from my house. And we were first going to school in Lewiston, Clarkston, which was about 45 minutes to an hour drive from my place. And because my sister had a lot of learning struggles, she's very ADHD, turns out. And the public school had wanted to diagnose her as ADHD and give her Adderall. And my parents were like, absolutely not. We're not doing that. And I had then taken her out of school. And she did some private tutoring. And so we ended up at this like homeschool type group in the Valley, Lewiston Clarkston Valley. That was, again, a great, pretty solid experience. It's another Christian school. I loved it. Yeah, absolutely loved the spiritual experience of that. And I didn't want to go back into secular school. And my parents were very into the idea of Christian religion or Christian education at that point. And at some point, I don't know how Doug Wilson and his work and his school had come across our radar. And I had really latched onto it. It's like, I want to go to the school. I want to be a part of it, of this greater Christian movement. I don't want to go back into public school. I had this real feeling of being separate from my peers in my small town in Pomeroy because we had done that switching of the churches, and we hadn't been in the churches where all my peers were. I didn't have the connections with them. And I was always told that we were better in some way. We had like the correct theology. So I
Mm,
felt like I was right. I couldn't go back into the government school, into a public school that's secular, where they might teach you sex ed and evolution, and that would be bad. um, and listen to lots and lots of talk radio about how terrible public schools were on our
mm,
way back and forth, driving to school. And so I had really latched on to the idea of going to Logos. And my parents decided that it was worth it to get us like a good Christian education to take us all the way up to Moscow.
mm. And for anyone that isn't aware of Doug Wilson and Logos School, and I know there's other associated ones like Greyfriars, but Logos and the church there, Christ Church, could you just give us, before we get into your part of the story, like what is it? Like what is that group? I know a lot of my viewers might know who that is and what they do, but for someone that's not aware of it, what is that group all about?
Yeah, Logos is the first school in the Association of Classical Christian Schools that Doug Wilson has basically founded and created. And it's the idea of going back to classical education methods and the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium is the grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So they teach in this way that's the younger years are grammar. So it's all about learning the rules and the rote memorization type thing. And then your junior high, middle school years is logic. So you learn how to think and think logically. And your high school is then rhetoric. And it's about being able to then communicate well and communicate based on logic and the things that you have memorized.
Right.
And so that's kind of the basic framework for how the schools operate. They
And
also
lots
have
lots of
all,
Latin mixed in there.
yeah, yeah, lots of Latin. I was just about to mention the Latin. And so I took 4 years of Latin and no Latin. It was terrible. I also had not taken Latin. All of the students that were in Logos had started Latin in third grade. And so we're pretty good at it by the time high school happened. And I was completely like, I had no Latin experience. Lots of church history. Uh, there was apologetics, theology courses. So a lot of my education was then taken by religious content, and less the ordinary educational content.
Mm. And just again to paint a picture, they're a school that is obviously a regular lower school, middle school, high school, but they have Greyfriars Hall. They're equipping people to be in ministry and to be pastors. Their church is known for some interesting things where they really stand out, and even to the point where other Christians notice this group is different. Could you, this is like a good point where we're probably about to jump into your story, but could you just tell us what are the things that you know that other Christians would say are unique about the Christ Church experience and just their whole Moscow mood, as they call it?
Yeah, they're all about like the idea of Christendom and creating like a Christian kingdom and a Christian community. So it's not just reserved to community within the church, but they're trying to create this Christian town essentially. And that's something that Doug Wilson talks about pretty extensively. He's written some books about basically taking over a town for Christianity. So it's not just reserved for Sundays. I think that would be one of the main areas of difference. They also tend to be
Mm,
more legalistic than your standard Christian, uh, at least from what I've seen.
yeah, I've read some interesting stories, but we'll save that for another time. But in terms of going back to what you first said, the whole idea of taking over a town, even I know that his father had written a book. His father has passed at this point, but had written a book about using, I believe, military tactics to bring into evangelism. Like you're literally trying to take over, and a lot of people have expressed an extreme amount of concern as to how that relates to Christian nationalism, because from what we can tell, they're obviously very, very serious about this stuff. They really do think that Jesus is real. They don't see it as mythology. They do see Jesus as not just someone to believe in, but to be bringing into the public square, and that especially in terms of their theology, as far as I understand it, with postmillennialism, that they're trying to take over, as it were, the world for Christ, starting with the local town, in your county, your state, your country, and when you look at Christian nationalism, it's kind of scary because they do appear to be not just intense about this and very, very driven, of course, in terms of their worldview, but they appear to be very well funded and very stealthy. And the more that I look at this, the more I don't think people understand, people in terms of the general population. I don't think they understand as much as to what danger is kind of lurking beneath the surface and how much they truly want to transform this country into a Christian country. Do you see that from what you've understood of your time there and from what you've studied of their beliefs?
Yeah, 100%. They're super intentional. And I think one of the things that scares me is the idea of like Iran. And it's like you look at the photos of women in the 70s and they're dressed in normal clothes, normal Western life. And that country was very much successfully taken over for a religious organization. And I think that is the same end goal of the Christian nationalists here in Moscow, Doug Wilson, and the other Christian nationalists, is the idea that we're going to turn America into this Christian nation that has certain rules. It would be obviously rolling back gay marriage, rolling back a bunch of the rights that we've won for people, for minorities, having a stricter understanding of the roles of men and women. You even hear some of the like pastors and elders and people within that Doug Wilson circle questioning whether women should be allowed to vote. And I ran into that a bit with my senior thesis, where Nancy Wilson was like, "Why do you think women should be able to vote?" And I'm like, "Isn't it obvious? We've got a brain of our own." So they very much are trying to. It's a very intentional movement. Doug Wilson picked Moscow, Idaho, because it's small enough that he can have a really major influence and he can basically take over that town, but not so small that it's not without impact. And it's also a university town, and there's a second university in Pullman that's right down the road. So his thinking around that is, I can come in, take over this town for Christianity, and then as these students are coming in, I'm going to influence them and send them out, and it's going to utilize the universities in those towns to also spread out my message of Christian nationalism.
And it does seem like there's also like a monetary part of this. It's scary as to how much money could be going through there. I don't have any idea as to what's going through there, but when you look at both things like just what they're doing with their church, donations there, but certainly Canon Press, their book selling stuff, but also even things like one of their sons is got a show on Netflix with Hello Ninja, and it's like, okay, there's some ways in which it appears that the funding behind this is probably bigger than we think. Who knows? I wouldn't even want to conjecture, but from what I can tell, from what other people are saying, it does seem like there is, in my mind, a concern. This is a bit of a side note from your story, and I'll give to your story in 1 second. But I remember, do you ever, what's his name? Ralph Reed. You know the name Ralph Reed? He was back, he was, I think, big back more in the Reagan days, but I met him once. He was at a church here in Atlanta. I've had the privilege, I thought at the time, to meet him. But I remember he was quoted at one point. There was an election at one point for a president, forget which one, but it looked like it had a really good chance of going to the Democrats. And when it was all tallied up, it was like heavily towards the Republican candidate. And there was a quote, people were asking Ralph Reed, what happened? You're obviously really big into, you're one of the movers and shakers in this. And he later, I think, apologized for phrasing it this way, but he said something like, "I want to work in such a way that you think you've won, and the next day you wake up in a body bag. Like you lost and you had no idea what happened." And it's probably a poor choice of words, but the point's taken, like you have no idea what we're up to. And when you wake up tomorrow, it's going to be completely different, kind of like to your illusion with Iran. And it is kind of scary. But maybe I was going to say, maybe we could table that too for another day, because I do want to get to your story. But it is interesting though that there's such a big part of Christian nationalism, and I do want to keep that as part of my platform's concerns. So
yeah, no, it's something that I'm quite interested in, and I find very scary. Watching The Handmaid's Tale I first had tried to read The Handmaid's Tale in high school and couldn't get through it because like it was just the cognitive dissonance was too much, because obviously the bad guys in the Handmaid's Tale they're portrayed as bad guys, and you understand that in the book. But when I was reading it, the bad guys were the people that were the good guys in my own personal life. And so I couldn't conceptualize it. So I stopped reading it halfway through because I couldn't get through it. And then I then picked up the book later, having deconstructed. I was like, oh, this is scary.
Yeah, that's interesting. I still have yet to read that. I'll put that on my list. Well, this is a great point then to talk about your experience there. We're going to kind of table the question of is Jesus really real, and is Christianity the correct worldview? We'll get back to that in a few minutes. But if you could take us to your time at Christ Church, what happened?
Yeah, so I was at Logos School, and I was there from 9th grade on through 12th grade. And I was obviously I was a new student, so I didn't ever quite fully fit into that community. My parents didn't go to Christ Church, and they weren't as into the community. And you figure out pretty quickly that the way that community works is the status of the children at the school is determined by the status of their parents at the church. And so I was the awkward new student, and I was able eventually to find some other awkward new students that didn't go to Christ Church, and then those became my friends primarily. With some exceptions. I think I did have friends that were at whose parents were at Christ Church, but then they turned out being the weird ones who were gay or non-binary, and they just were struggling with their identity in their own way, privately behind the scenes, and just having I can't even imagine how awful that would be to going through Logos and not matching up with that and realizing that you're different. So those were my friends. And I was a bit of the weird kid, a bit of an outsider, because my family lived so far away. I wasn't able to attend as many of the events. So I feel like I didn't have those close relationships. I didn't get to go over to my friends' houses as often. With a few exceptions. I started later in my high school years staying over at friends' houses because then I could drive. And
at times you literally flew in, right?
Yeah, I did. We literally flew in. My dad got us a little Cessna, and we'd fly into the Moscow Pullman Airport and then drive because we had an airstrip on the farm, which was great. That was probably the highlight of my high school experience, was flying into school, learning to fly. That was the best. And I was able to take flying courses at ground school at the local university, which was great. So that was the height probably of my high school experience. And
that is pretty cool.
Yeah. And the low of my high school experience would have been at midway through even closer to the beginning, like my junior year. One of my teachers began grooming me, and that would have been, it was classes was that would have been my church doctrine and rhetoric teacher. So I had 2 courses with this teacher, and he selected me out and began grooming me over the course of the next few months. Yeah.
What did that look like? What was he doing to groom you?
It was, I'd spent the evenings studying in his classroom. It was one of those classes where it was only 3 days a week. So then on Tuesday and Thursdays, there was a free period, and I had to wait for my sisters to finish classes so we could all go home together. And so I would just stay in the same classroom where I'd been before and then study in that classroom. And over the course of that time, he would be sitting at his desk. Other students would sometimes study in the classroom, sometimes they wouldn't. I was pretty consistently always studying in that classroom, would do my homework, and then I would usually pick the books that were the heaviest, so then I didn't have to carry them home. And it just made it so much easier for me to not have to worry about my homework when I got back and was tired, and after the long journey home, whether it was by plane or by car. And over the course of that period, I'd start to get to know him, and he got to know me. And I didn't realize this probably until a month or 2 ago. My sister had told me that he had been using my sisters as a bit of a catalyst, like a bit of a conduit to get to me. And so had been treating them as special and getting information out of them in a very intentional way, wanting to know what my interests were, what our family dynamics were. and really dug into who I was, and then use that information when I was studying alone in his classroom to get close to me and to connect with me.
Just before you go into the next part of that particular story, just to paint a picture, I'm assuming you would have been heavily indoctrinated with purity culture, and in that sense, not just trying to be pure, but also very naive in some ways. Like, what was your mindset before all that began in terms of, male female relationships and even your own body? Like, what was your perspective on all that?
I was super scared of male female relationships. I didn't understand my own body. I didn't know the terms for things on my own body, or how things operated. I didn't understand hormones. I learned about periods through the Diary of Anne Frank. And so when I had my first period, I thought I was dying, but thankfully I had just read the Diary of Anne Frank, and I was like, this happened to her too, and she talked about it in her diary. So I'm not dying. This is normal, I think. And then about 6 months later, told my mom, because I needed to figure out how to get pads. But I was still very freaked out about it and very ashamed of it. And didn't know the word for vagina. I learned that in university, which was really awkward. I shut down a college party in the dorms by asking, what is a vagina? And everyone's like, shut off the music. We need to explain this to her now. And one of the gals got out, her name was Florence. She got out a piece of paper and drew a vagina and was like, this is a vagina. You have one. These are the different parts. And everyone sat cross-legged on the floor while Flo explained what a vagina was to me during this dorm party. Did that, turned the music back on, and the party continued.
Crazy. But this in general, though, the naivety of how our own bodies work, but also, like you said, the whole fear of the opposite sex. And is it correct that in many of the ultra conservative Christian circles, I think including Moscow and Christchurch, that they would set up a paradigm for young ladies to think that a relationship with the man has an inherent danger factor, that you can't just be friends with him, that if you're in a relationship with any guy, that even just as friends, that unless you're super ultra careful, you're going to be inherently a temptress, as it were. Like, how would you put that in your words? Like, what was the dynamic like?
Oh, that was 100% the teaching, very explicitly. I did a Bible study with Nancy Wilson, I think my sophomore year, and it was like a lunch Bible study. And that was one of the things that she'd explained. And I couldn't get it into my head, because she was like, men and women can't be friends. Like, there's no such thing as a male-female relationship that doesn't have sexual component. And even then I was a little confused, because I was like, well, what if you're gay? Like, can you not be friends with anybody? Like, you can't be friends with someone of the same sex? It seemed a little confusing to me. And also I'd seen my parents have friendships with people of the opposite sex, and it wasn't sexual. So I was a little bit I did push back against that a bit, but in general, I was pretty scared to interact with the boys in my class. There's a few guys that I did have some friendships with. I did mock trial, and so I was friends with the guys on the mock trial team. And my class in particular was quite divided, say more so than a lot of the other classes at Logos. It was a very female-dominated class, and so we'd often, particularly through the first years of high school, sit on opposite sides of the room. It's almost like there was a barrier. There was a boys' side and a girls' side, and you didn't cross and you didn't interact. And there's some of the kids, the guys in my class, that I probably only said a couple of words to, and we had a class of 25, and I've not really spoken to them over 4 years of sitting next to each other in the classroom, just because I was so scared to interact with men.
It's amazing. It seems too like there's another side to it it's very much like a hand-in-hand thing, where whether you're aware of your own body and comfortable with it, and even aware of sexuality or not, there's this sense of regardless of where you're at with things, or where how your family has talked about it or not talked about it, that there's still a common goal that we're all shooting for, which is, we want you, of course, number one, to be a virgin on your wedding night. We want you to be as innocent and pure and unfamiliar with this stuff in terms of past experiences, the whole I kiss dating goodbye kind of stuff from Joshua Harris. We want you to come, as it were, and if you're going to wear a white dress, for it to mean something in their verbiage, you might say, and therefore we want you to come with this sense of you need to keep your body only for your husband, and in that, if you can do that, you're kind of hitting the highest echelon of purity, as it were, at least physically, because not just are you honoring your own body, in terms of like where Paul talks in the Corinthians about every other sin is outside your body, but the sins against your body are a little different. But also you're honoring your future marriage, your husband. But in the biggest picture, you're honoring the parallel that has with your relationship with Christ, that God is going to present his bride. He's going to make his bride this pure church that he's going to present to Christ as as his bride. And that has to happen. There has to be a purity there. God isn't looking to go give his son just a girl that has absolutely no value in that scheme. Therefore, the way you create that value is keep her really, really pure. And so it seems like for a lot of people that was such a big deal. Did you have a sense that even though you didn't know all the things you maybe would have wanted to know about how it all worked, that you were still like, was there a pride of saying, I'm, at least, apart from this story we're going to focus on in a second with the groomer, but just in general, your mindset, were you thinking, I'm going to marry and I'm going to give this, my future husband, whoever he is, this wonderful gift of my purity, and I'm ultimately giving that, as it were, to God. He's, I want him to see me as a pure vessel.
Yes, 100%. My mom did take it all the way to that. Don't kiss until your wedding day.
Okay.
That's when you have when you're supposed to have your first kiss. She romanticized that idea of purity. And my second cousin, had gotten married, and apparently that is what she had done. And I remember sitting in that wedding and being like, so they're gonna kiss, and this is like the first time. That's so scary. Like, can you imagine being in front of a room of 100+ people and your very first kiss is right there? And they did, and they had like a peck on the lips, and that was I remember thinking, oh, this is so uncomfortable. But my mom was like, it's the most romantic thing ever. This is the way it's meant to be. And so I was like, okay, I won't kiss a boy until that day. And it was also this idea of, I think in the Doug Wilson version of that, the father is meant to guard his daughter's purity. And I guess that would be in general purity culture, but it was like very explicit of that is the father's duty, and the whole courting and dating process. It wasn't a dating process, it was a courting process, had to go through your father, and you didn't really pick your own person. Like maybe you did to some extent, but it was the idea that the son, the boy, the man saw you and was like, oh, I'm interested in her. And so before asking you out, would go to your father and ask permission to ask you out. And it was the idea was like, oh, then your father's protecting you, and you feel you're so much more safe as a woman because you've got this intermediary. In reality, it just felt like, a bit of chattel slavery for women. Like, it's that Exodus, I think Exodus 21, the father is giving away his daughter and selling her essentially, and her virginity is the value, and you get your status within the community, and the sons that could be seeking after your daughter are determined by her purity. And so would you, it's so patriarchal.
Would you say that it felt in some ways like it was almost like the need is to constantly keep a woman under a man's authority? Like it's almost like, it sounds like you're kind of like an ideal, maybe I'm sure there's some exceptions, if a woman were to leave her parents to become like a nurse or a missionary, I'm sure there's exceptions to what I'm going to say, but like just in general, that the ideal would be to keep a woman under the man's authority of the daddy, and then she goes straight to her husband. So it's almost like he's kind of like the woman's being passed on from one man to another, as it were. Obviously not sexual with her dad, but it's still under the male authority. And like, was that kind of idealized to say we need women to stay? And maybe a corollary would be, was there a stay-at-home daughter concept of like, if you don't get married at 18, 19, 21, don't go get a job if, for the most part, in the world, stay at home if you can. Did they do that?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. It was this idea of, yeah, you don't go out and you're not independent on your own. And if you are, that's pretty questionable. And even I think the missionary example, maybe there's examples of single women going out as missionaries, but I feel like that would probably conflict with the teaching around women being teachers and going out and speaking to men. The idea is like women can only speak to women and only can teach women. Even like, yeah, it's like exceptions for children. So women can be teachers and teach children. But by and large, the idea of a woman going out and teaching men would not be considered good. Women being in a workplace where she could have authority over men would be considered a bad thing. You
Interesting.
wouldn't want to be a manager for a man. And yeah, the idea is very much that stay-at-home daughter. You stay at home, you go to the university where you ideally will get married. And if you're a good daughter and you're a good representation of the community, you're probably going to get married super young and super soon. Like there's none of this waiting until you're an old maid at 22.
22. That's crazy.
Yeah.
But real quick, before I want to go back to just in a second, but I do want to ask just one clarifying thing. You mentioned you had gay friends there, people that were probably much more struggling with the whole experience. Where were you at that point? Because I would have assumed that you would have been, and I say this because I know where I was, which was the worldview that would say gay people are very, very sinful, very, very wicked, totally distorting the way that God has designed sexuality and genders to work. I would have said that. I know most Christians, conservative Christians I was around would have said that. Did you feel like you were seeing it that way, or were you seeing some gay friends as being okay in their gayness? How did you see that?
Well, none of my gay friends that time would have been out of the closet. They would have been very deeply in the closet. But they just didn't connect in with the Christ Church community.
Okay.
The idea of being openly gay at that time would have been, you would have gotten expelled for that. There's no way that you could have been gay in that school, in that community openly. But I did struggle with the concept more so I think than my peers did. My aunt is gay and was married to a woman, and the woman she was married to was actually a pastor of a church in Portland, and I had so much respect and so much admiration for her. And so even as a teenager and being super into religion, I had a really hard time with this idea that because someone's gay, they'd be going to hell. Like that was a big disconnect for me.
Yeah. And yet a lot of the passages really do seem to indicate that. I know that I've seen a lot of Christians try to go back and redeem those passages, if you could say it that way, where they try to say, well, the Greek didn't mean this, or it, meant something different for, if you look back 100 years ago, it meant something different, or 1,000 years ago, it was, it's the interpretation has changed, but God's not actually against gays. He's against, whatever, pedophiles or something, but they kind of try to adjust the verbiage. But by and large, if you believe in this God, that if this God was real and this book was his holy book, he let a lot of people for, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, if not longer, have translations that said, if you are gay, you're going straight to hell. You're going to be in grave danger in the afterlife. And I really struggled with that too, in the sense that the whole issue of became, I guess, the question of, is it a choice? Once you breach that topic, it becomes very, very different. But I say to my shame, and I do mean to my utter shame, that I agreed at that time with that mentality of saying, it doesn't matter. It's not like it's that sin versus another. If you're sinning and you're staying in your sin, if you're delighting in it, if you're saying this is not a problem, you're basically giving the middle finger to the cross. You're saying, I don't. This is irrelevant. Christ's death is irrelevant. I want my sin, and I'm going to stay in it. And therefore, that was, of course, as a Christian dedicated to the kingdom of God and to the gospel. Like that's unfathomable. Like you have to fight sin in every sense, whether it's people getting unlawful divorces, as it were, or homosexuality, or whatever it was. Somebody gambling. You have to fight sin anywhere it pops up, and you have to call it like it is. And so I, to my shame, would have said some horrible things. Unfortunately, I didn't say anything. I didn't have a chance to, which I'm very grateful for. But if I had a chance to say something, I would have said some things that I deeply regretted. Um,
Yeah.
but it's interesting how,
Oh, I'm sure I've said some horrible things, and I said some horrible things as a teenager because I would never have let on to anyone that I felt conflicted about that.
mm, yeah,
Like that was like a very personal, and I would have like hidden that I had felt that way. So I would have been absolutely projecting the most horrible, homophobic, like all of the above. Yeah.
mm. Yeah. I remember just a real quick side note. I when I first moved to Georgia, I went to buy a car, and the guy that sold it to me, he was a Christian. He was going to a local church. I was, of course, excited to talk with him, and we ended up getting to spend quite a bit of time together as I'm waiting for like my loan to get approved and all that. And we ended up talking for so many hours that he ends up bringing up that he's gay and struggling with it because he knows he has to keep it quiet, and his
Mhm.
church is going to be, opposed to it if he talks about it. And it was like the first time I really had a heart to heart with somebody who was just a God honest Christian. He loved the Lord, he loved the gospel, but he was absolutely through and through homosexual, and he really struggled. And he was like, I think I'm just going to like not act on it, but I'm actually truly gay. And it was hard for me to hear his story in that depth, because I thought, so you're never going to act on it, but you're not going to, you're not interested in women, so therefore you're condemning yourself to a life of celibacy, is what you're telling me. And it really
Yeah.
got some wheels turning for me. It wasn't my deconversion story, but it definitely got some wheels turning. um well,
Yeah.
enough of, I do want to get enough time for your story. Could you go back to the grooming part of it? As you're being groomed, like what were some of the specifics that were happening, and how did that play out? Like what was the kind of the worst parts of that, and how did it end up, being exposed?
Yeah, he would start touching me just like casually and more consistently. And it was something that wasn't like didn't strike me as abnormal. There was another teacher at the school who he would go, he'd be like having lunch and he would go up to pretty girls at lunch or his favorites. And he would just like give them a back rub while they're eating their lunch. And it's like this had been happening since I was 14. And so he would just like start casually touching me, touch my hand, touch my shoulder, touch my back. Um, and that was just like a thing that was happening. And so I got used to that. And I was already pretty used to it because it was the dynamic at the school, that older Christian men would touch you. Um,
So creepy.
and it's so creepy. Like, and it was just like you just kind of adapted to things as being this is the normal thing. And I was always a little bit on high alert, being like, oh, is Garfield coming? Am I gonna get like a back rub now? Like, well, I'm talking to my friends and trying to it was always very uncomfortable. It's like you're trying to have lunch and trying to talk to your friends, and like the superintendent of the school is giving you a back rub. Um,
Can I ask you, do you think they would have, or did they ever do it like in front of their own wives? And like how creepy was it? Was it just part of their culture where they actually, like, was that part of grooming?
um, I don't remember it ever happening in front of the wives.
Hmm,
Uh,
it's very telling.
but the wives weren't particularly around either, not at the
Yeah,
school.
that's true.
But it was a known thing, like everyone knew. And like I knew who like Garfield's other favorites were because well, I saw him giving them back rubs and rubbing their shoulders and doing the whole thing. So that was basically Jim Nance, who was my abuser, did the same thing. And he'd start touching me, was very friendly. He would offer like counsel and advice. And I would ask him all my questions about God and about religion. He was the
Hmm,
church doctrine teacher. And so I saw him as this spiritual authority. And I very much treated him as like this spiritual authority. And he started like saying that I was like a daughter to him. And I believed that. And I assumed that was kind of the relationship. It was like this mentorship type relationship. And it would have been probably September. It would have been St. Crispin's Day. So I'd have to look up which day St. Crispin's Day is. I remember him giving me a hug because I got lost. Um, and then it would have been right before Christmas break was the first time he gave me like a full frontal hug, which in these Christian circles, it's like you don't do a full frontal hug. Like that would be inappropriate. Um,
Can't touch the boobs.
So
Can't touch the boobs.
don't touch the boobs. So you did like this awkward side hug, which honestly is so much more uncomfortable because then you're touching side boob. And I was just like, this is, so you couldn't do a normal hug. It's weird now as an adult giving men hugs and kissing them on the cheek because that's a normal cultural thing to do, and it not be sexual and be like, oh, like mind blown. Men and women could like give each other hugs as friends, and it's totally cool. But yeah, he gave me like the full frontal hug, and it like lasted for longer than it should have. And I remember being like, when is he gonna let me go? And being very uncomfortable because like my neck was up. I was just like uncomfortable. He held me for a very long time, and I was like, this is weird. Don't really know, like didn't fully understand like what was happening. Christmas break occurred. Had started texting me, like, so we were texting over Facebook Messenger. So we're messaging back and forth, but not as much over that first Christmas break, my junior year. I can't remember exactly when the texting started. I have to go back and look through, figure out my journals or whatever. And then for that next however many months, the second semester of my junior year, he would start hugging me more frequently. He would hug me like every Friday, like, have a nice weekend. And just the amount of touch and interaction increased, the amount of texting increased. But I still had it in my brain of, I'm just like the favorite student. I'm the teacher's pet. He sees me like a daughter. And that's kind of the way
So they weren't
viewed
necessarily red flags quite yet at that point, like red flags at the front of your mind of alarm bells?
Not really. But there was one point, and that I don't remember exactly when it happened. He had like given me a hug and had like rubbed my ass, and I was like touched my butt, and I was like freaking out about it. And I was like, what happened? And it was like very obvious, very intentional. I remember going and just like standing at my locker and staring into my locker, and like couldn't quite conceptualize what had just happened. And I just didn't think about it. After that, I was like, I stared into my locker for who knows how long. I have no conceptualization of how long I stood there, in kind of shock as to the fact that that had happened. And then it just didn't comport. And so I just discounted it and pretended it didn't happen and moved on.
It's amazing that just before you go into the next part of the story, how just like we would say we didn't have the words and the verbiage like the word vagina for our bodies and for what we're thinking and going through and feeling. And I'm guessing to even words like masturbation or what it meant to masturbate for a lot of people is just you just don't know, very ignorant. But then in addition to all that stuff that maybe is arguably just bare bones, you should know that stuff. Just the idea of words, having the words to say things like you mentioned the word grooming, the word molestation, the word assault, even crossing boundaries, just whatever that list of words are that we would use now to say, this is what this was, and how to tell the red flags versus like, this is a normal relationship and there's no problem here, like how to tell the difference. And it really stands out to me that's it. I think an issue for a lot of Christians is that they're not, in a lot of these circles, at least, they're not truly educating people as to how to know what's happening. And when you read stories like who's that guy, the Institute for Basic Life Principles, I forget his name, and these other guys, that just, you get this sense that they're getting women who are very sheltered. And it's like, when you get someone sheltered enough where they don't even have the words to put behind it, you can kind of keep on schmoozing your way and grooming, and they just don't know what to do. And it's like they're like frozen. And it sounds like with your locker description that there was like a deer in the headlights, like what the hell just happened? And if I would assume, and maybe this is a question, if you'd had the words, if someone had said to you, like say someone had seen some of that and said, hey, did he just assault you? Did he just molest you? Whatever. If you could have asked, well, I don't know, what does that mean? What exactly are you referring to? Would that kind of scenario have moved it forward for you?
Yeah, that would have been probably helpful. Like I didn't even have the word groping. So I had no language whatsoever to realize what had happened. There was also the disconnect of, it's like the don't go near my no zone or whatever they had. It was this idea that it would be other teenage boys that would be like trying to hit on me and might like try to grab my ass or something. And so I saw like he was the Christian leader. He was my teacher. He was the person that was revered by the church and by the school. He was an elder. He'd been at the school, like one of the longest serving teachers. And so he was the source of truth and the source of authority for me. And so maybe like if it had been like a younger, like a student who would grab my ass, I probably would have tattled. I would have said something. I would have been like, you don't do that. Like, that's not okay. But because he was in that position and he was the truth, he was the authority, he was the church leader, I just couldn't comport it. I just couldn't understand it.
Like it was just inherently safe by definition.
Yes.
He was safe even though he wasn't. What happened next? How did it escalate?
So over the course of the school year ended, over the course of that summer, he continued to text me pretty nonstop. And I was helping my family on the farm and was, I was driving semi-truck for my family. And there was a lot of downtime as I'm waiting. I was the person that would like drive up the semi beside my mom if she was in the combine, and she'd pour in and I would just drive beside her as she poured the grain into the truck. And so I just wait for her to get full. Once I saw her get full, then I would go and drive up. So there was a lot of waiting. And so I sat in the truck and I would text him and chatting back and forth. I'd also gotten into the school musical. I'd done the tryouts for that that spring. And so towards the end of that summer, I then had reason to come up to Moscow for the play. And because my sister was in, can't remember which running sport happens at that time of the year. It's either cross country or track and field. So she was running in the mornings and she did the full running calendar and was really into it. So I had to bring her up for running. And so I would drive her up. And at that point, Nance had asked to see me and get a coffee. And it's like, yeah, of course, like just getting a coffee. And I had told my parents about this. Like, it wasn't like I had so assumed that he was so like, it was innocent, everything was good. And I had just, the disconnect was so intense that I was like, oh, I'm getting a coffee with my teacher. And they're like, why? And I was like, well, I don't know. Maybe because he does it with all the students. Like, did
you see like a mentoring relationship at all?
And I saw him as my mentor, and I was like, yeah, okay. He's just taking me under his wing and he's getting me ready for the school year. And and so then had coffee with him. It ended up being awkward because like his daughter came in and like interrupted, and his daughter was older than me. She had recently graduated like 3 years before or something, or 3 or 4 years before. All of his children are older than me. Creepy. And did that, and then he started asking me to like meet him in other places that were like more secluded. So he'd ask to meet me in the Arboretum. The University of Idaho has this like lovely green space arboretum, and so he would meet me there, and would, at this point, he was like fully properly feeling me up, and so he would feel me up in basically the bushes around the Arboretum. And like every time I'd come up for whatever school related thing. And that school year began. I again had 2 classes with him, so was spending quite a bit of time. And there was a physics trip, and the physics trip was kind of it was a point where things got entirely like it was a transition point. He was quite friendly with me. My mother was concerned, had become concerned at this point. And so and he was the physics teacher. He's physics and calculus. So she had asked to be a chaperone on the physics trip. And there was the school secretary, Mrs. Roberts, who was also a chaperone on the trip. And she had 2 daughters, twin daughters, in my class. And so they were like the 2 female additional chaperones. And it was on that trip he'd become he was continuing to become very friendly. And he started this like shaming me. He's like, I don't want, like, you're giving like the appearance of sin. It's the word, like you have to be above any like even being suspected of sin, and you're giving the appearance of sin by spending so much time with me. But then he was also like pulling me aside and forcing me to spend time with him. And so he made me like a navigator. So I was in the front seat of the car and I had to like find the route, like do the directions. And so I was spending a lot of time, and my mom ended up getting the stomach flu on the trip. So she didn't see as much as she kind of like wanted to see him interacting. I remember him like playing footsie with me under the table as though like playing card games or something on the trip at the Airbnb. And like rubbing my leg under the table and doing all of these things like on the trip. And so Mrs. Roberts had observed it and was concerned. So had gone to the school and basically said like there's some really concerning behavior happening here. The way he's interacting with her. And he like pulled me off alone everywhere. I remember like being at sorry, I'm going back, like being at the aquarium, and he has like drugged me off alone at the aquarium, and I grabbed another friend because it's like he told me he didn't want to be seen alone with me, and now he's like making me go alone with him. So I was very confused, and I ended up like grabbing a friend and being like, come look at the otters with us, and like dragging her along.
Could I ask, with that background, just knowing where this is probably going, there had to be a sense of dirtiness, like on your part, of like when did that enter the equation of like he is kind of taking away my purity, at least a little bit, maybe not the whole 9 yards, but he's doing enough that I'm kind of like dirty now. When did that feeling start to come in, and how did you deal with that?
I think this was the trip where that started to happen, because at that point I so like thought of him as being in the right, thought of him as being this godly authority and this like, so like he could do no wrong. So if he was doing it, then it must be right. And it was on this trip where he started to say like, oh, you're giving the appearance of sin, that I was like, oh, am I doing something wrong? I don't know like what the boundaries are. And I was like, could this be bad? Like, I don't know. And then immediately after that trip, Mrs. Roberts had made a complaint to the school about his behavior towards me. And the school responded by not contacting my parents, but going and talking to Nance.
Wow.
They didn't investigate it. They just had a conversation with him. Don't do that. Your people are concerned. That doesn't look good. And Nance then conveyed that to me and said, like, oh, you're risking my reputation. Like you're causing like upset. And I know this is innocent, and you know this is innocent, but you're making like our interactions are giving the appearance of sin. And that was a point where it became a secret. And I no longer felt like I could share what was happening, because you kind of test out the waters a little bit. It's like, Nance is inviting me to coffee, and I kind of like want to see if that's weird. Nance he gives me really long hugs, like, and I'm vocalizing things. So I'm like, I'm not really 100% sure if it's normal, but it seems normal. He's the leader. It must be normal. It must be right. And that was the point where it then became a secret. And so immediately it escalated, and it went from being felt up to full on like proper molestation.
When you were going through that, did you have anyone you could kind of talk to, and even privately, and just say, I mean, did you feel like your parents would have been safe to talk to at that point, or a best friend or anybody?
I had felt pretty isolated from my parents at this point. And I did like not really. To the closest would have been like Esther, one of my friends. She kind of was aware, and I kind of spoke to her. I was like, yeah, I'm really close with him. And she's like, is that normal? And I'm like, I guess he's like a father figure to me, sort of, or a mentor. So I talked to her a little bit, but after that happened, that's when like the shame hit hit, and I felt like I couldn't speak to anyone about that, about what had happened. And yeah, and it became it just, at that point, it was full on. And he really started driving the purity thing. I needed to be pure for my husband, and that I was sinning. There was one point where he'd invited me, like he'd asked me to come to his classroom. It was a Saturday, so no one's at the school. And I was in the classroom, and he like took off my shirt and put his hand in my pants and penetrated me. And I was so shook. I was just so frozen. And I remember like sitting there and I was just like shaking. And like my whole face went numb. And I just like couldn't speak, couldn't move, just shook. And then he went like left me and went to the bathroom and then came back. And like I couldn't get, like I was shaking so badly I couldn't like get the buttons. Like, I couldn't get my bra latched back on. I couldn't get the buttons of my shirt done back up. And he then sat me down and lectured me on, don't you want to be pure for your husband? What are you doing? You've dirtied yourself, you've sullied yourself like before God, and just gave me a full-on lecture about my purity and not being pure. And then I bawling my eyes out, because like, well, I'm no longer going to, like, I'm no longer pure for my husband. I've ruined that. I'm no longer good enough.
And what do you think was happening in his mind though when he's saying that you need to be pure? Because when he's doing these things, he's obviously taking it the other direction. Like, was he just totally two-faced about it? And it just the basic sense of like, you should be pure, now let me do these things to you. Because it sounds like I don't understand why he would say those things. Did you ever figure out why he would say those things while he was doing those other things to you?
It was the cycle of shame and of bringing me into his sin and making me culpable.
Okay.
And
you're gaslighting almost.
Yeah. And as the woman, it's like I had been taught that I had the responsibility to guard and to protect my myself and my sexuality. And if I wasn't doing that, I had caused him to sin. I had been a temptress to him. I had it's very much taught like the men don't really have the responsibilities. Like men have these hormones, and they can't control themselves. And if they see a sexy woman, like obviously they have to. And he was also like, he also didn't have to like maintain his virginity, and that was something that I had to maintain my virginity. So I felt, I think, more of that pressure to maintain my virginity, be good, not pull him into sin. And so it became this thing of him throughout the entire thing. He would molest me, assault me, and then I would beg for his forgiveness.
It's hard to even imagine. And he'd what?
And then he would comfort me.
Wow.
And that's how it would start back in. It was like this cycle of, molestation.
What a mind
sin,
job.
and then comfort, and then through the comfort, molestation, and then.
So this, I mean, clearly at a certain point, this is way, way beyond just accidental touching. This is hardcore, like you said, molestation. This is assault. You still at this point didn't have the words to necessarily say what it was. At what point did this actually come out where this was happening? Because obviously that's a very unsustainable thing for you to be in such trauma. Like, how did it actually go from being totally private, or maybe I should say, how long did that escalated period last for? And then when did the shit hit the fan?
Yeah, so the escalated period would have been from September through to December. And in December, my mother had saw a text message on my phone from him, and it like come through. It was like 9:30 at night or something, and was super concerned. And she then wrote me a letter, basically being like, I don't want you contacting him. This is why, like, you need to stop.
Oh, so
Check
she wrote you a
yourself.
letter,
She wrote me a letter. I
like
think
as
she
opposed to
didn't,
talking?
yeah, as opposed to talking to me, she did not speak to me directly. I don't think
Hmm,
she knew how, which was
interesting.
a choice. Um, and yeah, so she like left the letter on my bed, and I immediately told Vance. Um, I panicked. I was like, my mom knows. We're gonna get in trouble. I thought I was gonna get expelled. I was like, it's all over. Um, and I was so ashamed of it, like that she could know. And I was afraid that more would come out because, like, at that point, all she'd known was that he had texted me. And so I told him, and he immediately the next day went and spoke with Tom Garfield, the superintendent at the school, and confessed to inappropriately texting me, because that's what my mom had seen, was that he was texting me. And
Hmm.
he had told me to delete all of the messages, and I did, as he'd asked. And at that point, I felt like, well, of course I'd want to delete them. I don't want anyone to know the sin. And he was, at that point, he had been properly sexting me. He'd been asking for nudes. Like on that physics trip, even, he had basically had me model all the clothes that I was to wear on the trip, and had selected all of my outfits for that trip, in order to please himself. So he had like selected the specific outfits.
Wow.
And he would select, anytime we didn't have the school uniform, he would select what I would wear.
Hmm. That's crazy. The story as it goes on, it sounds like it's crazier and crazier, and it really makes you wonder too. This is an aside, but it makes you wonder, like if his wife and the other elders' wives, for an additional part of it, like what they would have thought if they'd seen it. And it's hard to even imagine like the double life that might be going on in some of these cases, and for sure in that one, where it's just like you're not anything like what you profess to be, like who you are in this facade, this I'm the good teacher, I'm the good theologian, I'm the good whatever. Like it has nothing to do with reality. You are a complete other person, and you are truly assaulting a young innocent girl. That's just, it blows my mind. Blows my mind.
And it's like they become more legalistic and more holier than thou to like make up for the fact. Like we have
Yeah.
to enforce the rules even harder on everyone else while we are completely disregarding them.
Hmm. Can I ask, is it just a contextual question in this? I'm getting the sense too that there's there's a habit that I'm picking up on from Christchurch of trying to do your best to emphasize the fact that the gospel and the grace of God does cover sins in their theology, and that you don't want to ever get into a sense of like there's some sin that God's grace isn't big enough to cover. And therefore, even the most grievous sins, we still want to just ultra push this message of God can save you, and he can heal you from your sins and your addictions, even the horrible ones. But I've seen these stories, whether you're talking about the situation with Jamin White, where you're talking about Stephen Sittler, talking about other people where they arguably should have been much more protective of the victims, and instead they're protective of the people that are the actual people doing the assaults, the people committing these crimes. Did it seem like that dynamic was coming through in your story too, where they're trying really hard to emphasize, look, if he's saying he's sorry, then we're obviously going to forgive him and restore him, and put up maybe some boundaries. But especially if he's really diminishing his sin, he's like, well, in his mind, I've done 10 things, and I'm going to confess one of them. Oh, that one thing we're going to slap your wrist for, and get a boundary out for that one thing. But it's like the other 9 are still out there. We haven't even talked about them yet. But if we can focus on the forgiveness aspect, that we're doing the Lord's work. Do you feel like that is part of this at all?
Oh yeah, it's hugely part of it. And that was one of the things that, like, after everything went down, that after it became public, it's like, well, he repented. He's asked for forgiveness, and of course we must give him like forgiveness. But this is one of the main issues I have with Christianity, and the doctrine of Christianity is there's a lot of not taking responsibility for your actions. Like repentance is you get to repent to God and to the church leaders and not actually take responsibility to the people that you have harmed. And one of the things, like they had Nance write a letter to my parents confessing our sin, as in my sin and his sin together, and apologizing to my parents as if I'm, again, just chattel. I am the owned property of my father. And it was never an apology. And they're like, well, he apologized to you. He's confessed and he's asked for forgiveness. It's like, no, he didn't ask my forgiveness. He hasn't apologized to me. And an apology to me would mean you take responsibility for your actions and you go to the police station and you say, here's what I did. And I plead guilty. That would be asking forgiveness and repentance. And instead, repentance is I get to tell the big man in the sky that I've done a bad thing, or I get to tell the priest in an enclosed space where no one's going to actually hear, and they can't tell anyone, or they're not supposed to tell anyone what I've done, and it's anonymous. And then I'm absolved of my sin. There's never any taking of responsibility for the way you mistreat people or the crimes that are done.
Well, that's kind of where I was going to go next too with the questions is, did this escalate to the authorities at all?
Not at this point. It didn't immediately go to police. And I think there was an understanding. My parents believed that had been the case, or I believed at least like police had been consulted because they were told that there would be like a restraining order and that he wouldn't be allowed anywhere within the vicinity of the school. And they thought that it had been covered, appropriately approached at this point. But that was not the case. And it was one of the things that came up recently on Twitter was the idea, and it's in Wilson's blog, that I covered it up and that I was culpable of this cover up, which I was never actually given any opportunity to speak on what happened. The only time I was ever consulted or talked to about the situation was I was brought into Tom Garfield's office, and Tom Garfield, again, is the one that was rubbing everyone's shoulders, with my parents. And Tom Garfield was best friends with Nance, and he had chats with Nance and had gotten his side of the story. And one of the things that Nance had said and had really pressed was that he hadn't even kissed me. And I think that was a very intentional choice where he could then have this plausible deniability. And so I got into that office, and obviously he had done so much more than kiss me at this point. Like the kissing was totally irrelevant to the whole thing. And I got into his office and he asked, did Nance kiss you? And I said, no. And that was it. Like further questions were not asked. He didn't ask like if he touched me inappropriately. He didn't. So I was never, again, I didn't have the language with which to explain what had happened. I was super ashamed of it. I was in this space with my parents who I didn't want to know. And because I felt like I had betrayed them. And then there was no questions asked. And so I wasn't given any space. And in the next coming weeks, I kind of I was like waiting around expecting that maybe like someone would come talk to me, like maybe they'll pull me aside and have a conversation and ask, because I really wanted to share. I didn't know how to. I was scared to, but like if someone had asked me questions, I was like, I wanted to share. And because the police weren't notified, there was never a proper investigation. And so the police were never given the opportunity to interview me and to speak to me right after it happened. They'd also asked if the messages still existed. And I said, no, they didn't. I deleted them. And I remember Garfield being like, oh, that was, being like, oh, that's too bad. It would have been nice to know like what that was about, but probably for the best or something to that effect. And, but like, again, if police had been notified then, the messages could have been uncovered and we would have had a very clear timeline. Because I do struggle. Like I figure out when things happened based on Like I can remember like what classwork I was working at the time. My brain, it doesn't quite like I have a really hard time properly putting it together. And so I have to like use signs. I'm like, it was cold out. The leaves were this color. And so I've got like the weird disassociated connections to try to like piece. And I've sort of through time and by writing been able to piece together when things happened. So that my journals and all the things. Yeah. So no, it was not dealt with appropriately at all. And it was very clearly and carefully covered up by Wilson and by the school.
Can I ask, with when the note of it being covered up, I've heard that there's a real strong sense that they have of just wanting so badly to pursue the piece of the church where you just try to keep things as in-house as possible, keep the drama private, and just try to at least have this facade of like, we are a unified church, we're a strong church, we don't have these very serious, crucial issues going on. And in that environment, it seems like it would be so easy for some newcomer to walk in and just be like, oh, this is a healthy church. Look, they're singing the songs, they're preaching the gospel. But as you get into the real meat, as it were, of the church life, to realize there's like a whole underbelly here that we didn't see at first. And it breaks my heart that people didn't come to you and ask you, not just tell us more about what happened and, hey, do you need to kind of have some private chats with us to kind of get this off your heart, but also just to say, like, you need to do that, not just to confess, sin, if that's what they're encouraging you to do, or to talk it out just to kind of heal, but just in the sense of like saying, like, how are you doing? And like, how are you processing this? Assuming you love the Lord and you want to be as close to him as possible, how did this situation affect your walk with Christ? Like, was there anybody that just reached out and said, I want to really walk through this with you, make sure you're as close to the Lord as possible?
Yeah, no one reached out to me. No one checked to see if I was okay. And I wasn't okay in any way, shape, or form. Like, and I think it was pretty obvious that I wasn't okay. I lost a lot of weight. I was pretty anorexic.
Wow.
I stopped associating with my normal friend groups and people that were in my age group because people kind of knew. Like there was like the rumor mill. You kind of like there's lots of like elders' children and like people were associating. There's like there was so there was talk and like why had Nance gotten fired, and there'd been the letter that had gone out to the parents, and so I just mostly like hung out with my sister's friends, and because the younger students didn't have any idea and were totally oblivious to any of the drama, and it wasn't something that people were talking about. And so I didn't have to deal with all those conversations of what happened to Nance. Why is he no longer? Because he had stepped down after this, and they had sent out a lovely letter about
Stepped down as opposed to being fired.
Yeah, they said use the word step down. And he's working on his like it was like pray for him and his family, and it was this lovely send off.
Insane. Could I ask, with all that going on, was there? I know you wouldn't know what was going on per se in all the private conversations because you wouldn't be there, but for the ones that you did know about or were heard enough rumors to kind of guess what was going on, the whole concept of like what they call slut shaming, was that happening where you were being seen as like that Nance wasn't the one doing Jim Nance wasn't the one doing these things and therefore deserved the shame, but that you had, even if he had done some bad things, that you were the ultimate source of the whole situation, as if you'd created and caused it?
Oh yeah, 100%. Actually, it was just the other day this tweet had come up, and it bothered me. Like, and it was someone like who was explaining like a situation where they'd been in, and that like I had come out at dinner, and it was someone that apparently had gone to school with me, had been like a classmate or close. I don't know who it was. But they basically go, oh, but everyone knew Emilie was a slut. Like everyone knew that she was like this. And like even now, like even then I was like, I read that and I was just like, oof, because I remember just feeling it. And it's hard to point to things, but it was very much this idea that I was promiscuous.
And it sounds like that was the furthest thing from the truth, and that you were just a really strong academic student trying your best to do everything you could for the school and your theology and your walk with Christ. Like that sounds like it was nothing but total fabrication. Like how do you think they get away with that? Those stories, by is it just they're just lying through their teeth everywhere, or like how do they convince whole groups of people of things that are just utterly untrue?
I mean, I think it's that, I mean, we've been primed to believe that the woman is always somewhat at fault and that men can't control themselves. We had all those chats about modesty and modesty culture and
Hmm.
can't possibly wear the wrong thing, or you might attract the wrong, you can't smile or be too friendly with a man, or they might think you're flirting. And I think it's been just so primed that the idea that the woman had done something wrong to attract it just was the obvious assumption.
Hmm. It's almost like a default. It's almost maybe not for
Yeah.
every church, but like a default of if you got a good godly man and he falls, it must be the woman's fault. Like it just has to be.
Yeah.
She
And I
was
will correct what I just said. In this case, not woman, but girl.
hmm, yeah,
Yeah.
crazy. In terms of where it went from there, did it ever go to the authorities?
It wasn't until years later that the authorities ever got involved. And that was because of me. Not because of anyone. Yeah. Uh, it, yeah, basically because no one had approached me and no one had tried to reach out. The only person that did reach out was Nance. And so it had just restarted, and that cycle was just continued. And so when like after I graduated college school, it just full blown began again. And Nance was like welcomed onto the school grounds. That was never, he went on walks every day at lunchtime with the superintendent. I saw him. The two superintendent even like initiated a conversation between the two of us, um, so we could speak. And I don't know why. Uncomfortable. I was like, okay, it's closure. I'm moving on. But that's obviously not what happened that same night. Nance then rekindled the whole thing, and it started and continued in the way it had. Except now there was some distance because I had gone away to university. So that continued for a whole nother year of him abusing me through my freshman year of university.
Hmm.
And
Through texting only, or through physical
through
activity?
texting, and then whenever I came home, it was physical.
Hmm.
He'd ask to meet me, and a lot of people are saying like, "Oh, she was an adult now. Like she must have known better. Like she can't like can't cry victim, can't cry wolf at this point. Like she's responsible. She was over the age of 18, and lived somewhere else. And she was agreeing to meet him. So I think that's obviously a serious misunderstanding of the way these abuse dynamics work. And I was in such a vulnerable place mentally. Like I was suicidal and um, self-harming and anorexic and just struggling. And so I was still quite easy pickings for Nance because of where I was and how vulnerable I was at the time. And because I felt so ostracized from the community, it seemed to me like he was the only person that could kind of understand where I was at. He was culpable with me. And so I felt that, well, at least if he still loves me, then like I can't be totally unlovable. And I still saw him as this like idealized, holy, godly man. So despite everything that had happened, I still thought of him as this religious authority in my life. And everything he said was the truth and was gospel. And
Hmm.
he was this interpretation of God to me, and I wanted to be holy. So if he reprimanded me, it was like I was being criticized by a church leader, by an authority. Even though I was of age, I wasn't in any, it was still assault, and it was still abuse, and it still wasn't consensual. And it took me a long time to understand that, and to not blame myself and not think that it was consensual. It wasn't until actually having consensual sex and realizing what consensual sex was that I was like, oh, this is different. And there's no, like, my body reacts differently. Like, you don't just sit there and shake. Weird. But I didn't know what sex was like, or what to expect from sex. And I never even Googled anything. So I didn't know that just freezing up and feeling tense and in pain was not normal. And so, yeah. So I thought I was consenting, even though I didn't really understand the word consent. And I remember trying to, like, going through the consent talks at university and being so confused and very frustrated, because I was like, that's not how it works. And I was like, that's not that, like, so, like, trying to explain consent to us. And I was just like, it's like, no, you're wrong. That's not how it works. That's not what this is. Because I couldn't conceptualize the fact that, no, I was being abused and I was being assaulted.
It sounds, I mean, the more that you talk about it,
Yeah.
it's like he took so much away from you in terms of your innocence and your purity and your ability to call it what it was, your ability to just have the verbiage in your own mind to say what was going on and to stand up for yourself. I mean, when someone in authority like that uses that authority and that privilege and that, as it were, the mentor student, teacher student, or whatever it is, minister, pastor, student dynamic, whenever you have those power differentials, both in terms of like the school structure or the church structure, but also just your worldview structure, like you see him as this spiritual leader to you. There's just no way for it to be consensual. And it's like the more you tell your story, I'm like just blown away by how much he took away from you. And it's amazing to me that we're creating these, little Christian communities where this, I would assume, can continue, where it could just fester and do it again the next generation and the next generation after that, where this is not really something that they're changing the dynamics on. And it breaks my heart, especially when you're looking at, even before you look at the abuse, just the patriarchal stuff you started with, of like, you're under your father and then you're passed on to another man. It's like the autonomy is just decimated. And it's like the idea of you being able to think of yourself separately from a man and from marriage, and to make your own claims as to what you want your future to look like. And also the autonomy for your own body to say, my body's mine. Number one, I need to be asked if I want to be touched or whatever, if I want a relationship. And also the idea that you're not a temptress. I mean, the beauty of being able to get it through to the next generation of women, to say, you're not a temptress because you have curves. I remember this one lady I interviewed. She was a worship, like on the worship team at her church, and she was, larger and curvier, and she was at a church where you'd be more charismatic, and she'd be like dancing, like, praise the Lord, praise the Lord. But because she's up there bouncing around, like, she had to have a talking to, because the men can't focus on the words on the screen because of you. And it's like, it really blows my mind. And just a quick aside
And
here,
there's no responsibility for men, none.
No responsibility. And just a quick aside, like something that blew my mind when I was a Christian, in a positive sense, that relates to this, the ability to see a woman's body as yes, like, there can be sexuality in our relationships, but you can also see a woman's body as simply she's a beautiful creature, but it doesn't have to be she's a beautiful creature, therefore I have to have sex with her. And I remember, if I was doing research for a book on the body, and I was writing from a Christian perspective, and it was a big book. I still got it. It's like 1,000 pages. But as part of the research, I went and got certified as a lactation counselor, not to be because I wanted to do it as a job. I knew that I was struggling with this sense of, all these guys around me are talking about the struggle with porn, and they just see a woman's body as like this, the whole sexual thing is like, I want to just see it from a purely medical perspective, just to see how that changes things. And I went for a week. It was this class of almost all probably nurses and stuff, 30, 40 women. I'm the only guy in there. And I'm like, 25 years old. They're just like shocked that a guy's actually showing up to this. And of course, it wasn't pornographic. They're just talking about how lactation works. And
Yeah.
I'm like blown away by some of the ways that it changes, your perspective. Things like, if a baby gets sick, the mother kind of gets sick too, so that her milk changes and it changes what she gives to the baby. And it's like it becomes more medical at first, but it's like, okay, a woman's body is amazing, but I can see her as this amazing living art, this amazing creature. It doesn't have to be something where it's all about my hormones. She can just be amazing. End of story. Like, she's amazing, period. Not she's amazing, therefore
Yeah.
I have to have her. And it really, a lot of situations like that in my life changed my perspective and said, we're just so hypersexualizing people with this purity culture. I know that's, everyone's saying that these days. I'm not novel in that, but it's like we're sexualizing people to the point that they can't just look at someone else's body and say, like you said, with the hugging, side hugging, like, I can just appreciate you as a person. It doesn't have to be sexual. And
Yeah.
you get to a point where you step back and you say, what the hell are we doing to ourselves? Just what are we doing? It's crazy.
Yeah. And it was so weird because it was just pushed that, oh, the secular world, the world outside our little church bubble is so sexual. And, oh, like, look at the magazines, look at the whatever. And then realizing after being an adult, having sex, being no longer being Christian, it's like, wow, I'm not thinking like my life isn't obsessed with sex. I'm not constantly worrying about sex, worrying about perception. How are men viewing me? I'm just like, just existing. I have a sexual aspect of my life. That is good. It is an aspect of my life. It isn't my entire world. And I'm not constantly like, and it was just, it was so refreshing to be in like a less sexualized context, having left Christianity. Like, oh, actually, the normal world isn't all about sex all the time. Actually, there's quite a few places where it'd be inappropriate for sex to be involved. Like, it's like you just do your thing, you do life, and
With that dynamic, did it make it feel like they were hypersexual, like like as if they were really the people with the pornographic mindset?
oh yeah, looking back, it's like, oh wow, like we are telling young girls that they have to wear skirts of a certain length and measuring their skirts because they might be causing men to look and causing men to sin. I remember being like going over to a sleepover at a friend's house, and he was a church elder, and I was wearing like normal pajamas. Like, I don't like, they were pajamas. I was a tank top, singlet, and a pair of shorts. And that was what I wore to bed, like real normal. And I was told like afterwards that like by her, she'd come up to me and had like, she was been forced to like confront me about it. Like, her dad didn't talk to me. Like, she had a talking to by her father, which was, your friend can't come over anymore because her pajamas are so sexual and they might cause me to sin. And so then she had to then approach me and tell me that I wasn't allowed to come to her house anymore unless I had more modest pajamas.
Wow.
And it's like, you were sexualizing like a child over at a sleepover with her friend. Like, how gross is that?
It makes you almost like I've just had the heebie-jeebies, as they say it, in your spine, thinking about like you've got a bunch of men who like sitting in this church, and like they're like, if they happen to see a bra strap, or they happen to see a woman's curves, that they're just like, they can't do anything but just land into this hypersexual mindset. And it really it's like, in some ways it's betraying the fact that, and I've said this many times on my channel, but it's one of the many tip-offs that there's no power in the gospel. The gospel does not change lives like people claim it does. You don't end up becoming healthier. You become much more toxic when you're trying to land your whole worldview on the gospel. Like, the power isn't there. There's power to heal ourselves. We have power to make good decisions, to move away from bad habits. But like, the power of the gospel to transform you and make you mature and healthy, it's just not there. You can have a church full of these men who are creepy as hell, And you're like, you guys have been under the gospel for how many decades? And this is how you think? Oh, hell no. This isn't
Yeah.
healthy. The gospel's not doing a damn thing for you.
Yeah, that was the thing when I finally left Christianity, it felt like I got salvation. Like they talk about, like everyone talks about their salvation experience and this idea of like, oh, you're freed from sin and you no longer have the shame, the guilt. Jesus has saved you. Like he's died for your sins, and so you don't have to like stress about that anymore. And you can feel like comfort. And for me, leaving, like stopping believing in Christianity gave me that exact sense of, oh, I'm free from sin, because I don't think sin is a concept anymore that's even worth, like, I don't believe in sin. I don't believe in this idea. I believe that you can treat people badly, and you then go to those people and you make it right, and you do your best. You go through life. Like, none of us are obviously perfect, but like, you don't have to beat yourself up over every single little thing. And like, you don't have to have a problem with your own natural inclinations, or it's just amazing how much less like obsessing you're not going down this like spiral. And I found my mental health just completely improved. I was no longer obsessing over everything I could be doing wrong. It's like I can't like look at someone and be like, oh, they're attractive, and now I can just be like, oh yeah, like that person's attractive. And I'm no longer being like, oh my God, what's going on in my head? Like, and I'm bisexual, so I've had like plenty of times where it's like I see a woman, I'm like, wow, she's really hot. Like, and now it's just like, oh, she's really hot, and then that's it. And there's like no further like end of conversation. I appreciate it, but like in the past, I would have just sat there and beat myself up, and been, and it just created such a, yeah, it was a mind fuck.
It's amazing. Real quick before we do, I do want to dive back into your deconversion in a minute, but did this ever, the story we just wrapped up, did it ever kind of go to an official police level where there was an investigation, and how did that land?
Oh yes, sorry, I got lost in the narrative a bit. So a year after I like gone to university, I was living in Washington D.C. and I had a housemate, an older Christian woman, not much older, and I'd have been 19, and I was able to like build a friendship and a relationship with her, and she felt trusting, and I felt safe with her. And eventually I told her what had happened in high school. And at this point, I'm still talking to Nance. He's still a part of my life, but I was so desperate to tell someone. And she was the first person in my life that I felt safe enough to actually share. So I shared the first part about what had happened in high school and hadn't shared the second part yet about the fact that he was still there. And her reaction was like of love and of compassion and of, are you okay? And you did nothing wrong. And I'm so sorry that happened to you. Are you okay? And
Mm.
it, and providing support and friendship. And that blew my mind, because up until that point, I thought that I would just be rejected outright. I didn't think that I could safely tell someone without the relationship being destroyed, and then they looking at me and be just disgust. Like, oh, she's like the worst kind of sinner. She's caused a man to cheat on his wife. She's seduced someone. And I basically had taken the community's push on me that I was this promiscuous woman, and believed that, and I believed that about myself. And so when she told me that, like, or when she didn't react that way and she still loved me and she's just still my friend, it unraveled everything. And it, like, the pieces just like they started to fall. And it was shortly thereafter, it would have been that autumn, I ended up telling her the rest of the story, and that Nance was still a part of my life. He was planning on coming to Richmond, Virginia, and he wanted me to stay with him in his hotel room. And I was terrified. I did not want to do that. And so that was the point. That was like, I have to, like, I can't, I got to get out. Like, I don't want to be raped in this hotel room. And so I told her, and she helped me to end it with him and to break it off and to stop him from contacting. And he still tried to contact me. Like he tried all of the different routes, like various email, LinkedIn, and like he was trying every way possible. He'd like put cryptic messages up on his Instagram. And because that was all going on, I just like went to New York for the weekend, like that time that he was there, because he tracked my phone and so knew where I lived, knew like what my habits were. And I was scared that he would find me. And so I went that weekend away while he was on that side of the country. And that was like the final ending of it. And he still, like after that, he still tried to contact me. And I came home for Christmas that year. And at that point, I told the school what had actually happened because I feel like there was like this need for that closure. Unfortunately, the person I told about it was Tom Garfield. And Tom Garfield then told Nance, as per usual, always. It was a very uncomfortable conversation too. Like Garfield wanted to know the details. He was like, did he go down on you? Did you like it? And I'm like, it was very uncomfortable. And he then spoke to Nance, and then Nance again confessed. And he went to Wilson, and Garfield then went to the new superintendent at the school. And the new superintendent was like, we have to report this. And was like, yeah, this has to happen. And there was a lot of pushback towards, I believe, is my understanding. But he went to police and had said that he'd hoped that Wilson would also come and give a police report, because Wilson had been intrinsically involved in this entire story and everything that was happening around it. Like he was the person that spoke to my parents. He was a decision maker in all of this. So Wilson then went to the police after like pretty much being strong-armed into it and shared, and the police reached out to me and talked to me on the phone. But at that point, I would not have said a proper investigation was done. It was, I chatted with police on a phone call, and I was distraught and in a panic about it becoming public. And I was triggered. I was so triggered by being back there, being in places where Nance had assaulted me, going into the school. And it's like, he pushed me up against that bookshelf, or he pushed me against that wall, or that's where that happened. And it was just like, I was just so triggered. And by everything that had happened in that entire thing. Basically, police didn't, I wasn't entirely honest with police in the way that I should have been. And part of me still didn't want to believe that I had been assaulted. And I had a really hard time. Like I was still like holding on to like responsibility for my actions. And so I felt that I still felt that I caused it, and I still believed that I was at fault. And so I didn't want to be found out, because I still thought, and I still had the shame that I was the seductress. I was this promiscuous woman. And so I didn't want anyone to know. And because if they knew, then they would know the truth about me. And I still believed that everyone in my life would reject me, and I would be unloved and unlovable if anyone knew what had happened truly. And so I wasn't honest with police. And I very much regret that. I do think that the police could have done quite a bit better and actually spoken to me in person, asked me to come to the station, sat me down, and done a proper conversation instead of just calling me. And I think they knew that I wasn't being entirely honest. I wasn't in a good place. And I was, after that conversation, quite suicidal. Nancy Wilson then reached out to me in the aftermath of this for counseling, and her counseling was horrendously awful. Like, I ended up with things from counseling getting spread about. I would do a counseling session, and then Doug Wilson started writing this blog that was like essentially in response to my counseling sessions. And he may get angry for me for saying that, but it was and at the time I kind of recognized it would be like I would say things to Nancy and I'd have these conversations. I was worried about things, and then she would send me a blog post, and it was like, look at Doug Wilson's most recent blog addressing your concerns. And
Wow.
he couldn't talk directly to me because obviously I was a seductress and we couldn't have that. Like, he couldn't be in my presence. So we do this weird wrapped around public blog thing, and Wilson gets to virtue signal about counseling women through sexual abuse.
Wow. It's crazy. And I've read enough from Nancy Wilson to know that that's just altogether a bad idea to have her counsel anybody.
Yes.
Wow. Did it ever escalate with the police beyond that in terms of a court case, or is that as far as it went?
It didn't happen until later again. So a couple years went by. I cut off counseling with Nancy Wilson, and eventually left the church. And when I left the church, I made a post on Facebook sharing my story publicly and sharing what happened, and it blew up, as one would expect. And I also shared like why I wasn't a Christian and what was how that came about. And then police reached out to me, and because I'd seen the post, and it started an investigation. But at that point, I lived in Australia. It became quite complicated. There was so much time had gone by that there wasn't as much evidence as there would have been originally. And so it just got dropped. It takes a lot for you to be able to pursue a case like that. And when a certain number of years have gone by, that becomes more and more difficult. And I think that's one of the great struggles with these cases of childhood, teenage sexual abuse is you're not of an age that you're capable of talking about it. It took me many years to be able to speak about this and not have like breakdown, not fall apart. And so it took a while to become public, and because it took so long, then a lot of the evidence was no longer as accessible, and so police weren't able to pursue it. One of the things that I keep seeing Wilson say publicly is police investigated and they determined that nothing had happened. That is not what police determined, and that is not what police said. Police said, we believe that a crime has occurred here. We believe that something has happened here. However, this is not like we're not able to pursue it because we aren't able to get the evidence necessary to take it to a court and to get a conviction. And police don't take things to a court unless they think they can get a conviction, unless they have enough evidence prepared and ready to go that they can actually get it there. They'll just drop it. And so they were, the officer that I was working with definitely, like, he believed me. But it's one of those things where, I mean, I think it is a good thing that our court system works that way, that it's beyond a reasonable doubt before you take away someone's freedom and imprison them. But it does not mean that they're innocent, and it doesn't mean that the police determined that he was not guilty. That did not happen. They determined that there wasn't enough evidence.
Yeah. It just breaks my heart that it happened that way, from start to finish. I do want to, of course, take a few minutes at the end here to talk about your deconversion, but just to wrap up that part of it, I'm sure I'm speaking for a lot of people who are watching, just to say we're so sorry that you went through that. That's beyond heartbreaking. Our hearts break with you that you had to endure that, both the actual, of course, from my vantage point now as a deconverted person, the indoctrination in the first place into this Christian mythology and the purity culture, and ad nauseum. But in addition to that, of course, the grooming and the assaults, and then the cover-ups and the ways that this was put on you as if you were some kind of criminal. You got so much of your innocence and so much of arguably some of the years that should have been the most beautiful years of your life stolen from you. And just our hearts break for you, and I'm very sorry that it happened. I wish so much that these things were not so common. It seems like there's more and more of these stories coming out, but so sorry that it swept you up in it, and I'm so sorry that they accused you of being, the cause of this, as if there was some guilt that was for you, as if a young girl in that situation could ever be culpable. It just Can I ask, before we get to your deconversion, how is the healing from that gone as you've moved past it, and it's, as you like you said, it's not going to a court situation anymore, but just in terms of your mental health and your heart and through it all, how have you been with healing from that specific issue?
It's obviously it's been a process. I think for me that it was a big thing. Leaving the church, that was probably the biggest step for me. That was the start of the real healing. Before that, I tried really hard to look for comfort in the Bible and to look for those passages of healing. And I did have some passages that I found that like were somewhat comforting. But ultimately, I think the message of the Bible, when you're reading through the Bible, it doesn't have that support for victims. That women being culpable it's intrinsically in the Bible. And I'm like reading the story of Tamar, his name. Yes, it's been a while. And Absalom in the Old Testament, where it's like she's raped by her brother, and her other brother is like it's one. She's like the shame that it's like it's not the trauma of the rape itself. It's she's no longer a virgin, and she can no longer wear the pretty virgin outfits, and it's like trying to find comfort in that. It's like, oh, she's not like she's now ruined, and this whole idea of now that she's been assaulted, she's ruined. And I remember like reading that and being like, where's God having compassion and love for this woman that's been raped? And the Bible is obvious, like it's very clear that it's rape, and yet it's still like she's now lost her worth. And so that I found that so heartbreaking and so hard, and I just couldn't. And then she had the one brother that did defend her and that supported her, and then he ends up being the bad guy in the story and dies hanged by his hair from a tree. And a classic Old Testament story. And I felt like the entire, like going through the Bible, it's all about you have that like women's purity, and I had getting away from that and finally realizing that this wasn't going to be the source of my healing allowed me to take those first steps on a healing journey. As much as I wanted to believe that Jesus had died for my sins, I'm now forgiven, that required me believing that I was guilty and was sinful and had committed these sins. I had been the seductress, had been culpable in my own abuse, and if I was to get freedom from the pain I felt from that abuse, I needed to ask God for forgiveness and ask Jesus for forgiveness that he could free me from my sin. And it wasn't until realizing that actually, no, I didn't sin. I was a victim, that I was then able to start that journey and that process of healing. The other things that I've found that have been just super helpful have been writing my story out and telling the world and being open about it. I found for me, so much of this, it's like it happened in secrecy and everything was covered up. Church was covering things and trying to protect itself. And I've got a nice email from Wilson about like, we have to we can't let this get out. Like, look at how much risk you're causing. You might cost me money. So it's all about like this, you got to protect the reputation of the church. You got to protect the financials of the church. And I felt like I had to hide and cover. Otherwise I would be rejected by my community and by everyone I loved. So being able to be public and speak about this has been so freeing. And yes, there are people that come and they say awful things and they still blame me for it. I expect that. I don't like, it doesn't faze me. I'm like, yeah, it is what it is. But then so many people can look at that story and see it for what it is and see that, yeah, I was a young girl that wasn't guilty. So being able to process that by writing. It's been so helpful. And
Mm.
yeah, it's also nice being distance. That's the other thing that's quite good. I'm not in a place where I'm being constantly triggered by it. I'm not being constantly triggered by religion or Christianity here either. It like Australia is so much more secular. It's just not baked into our system. Like in some places it is, but not to the same extent that it is in the United States. And so I don't feel that constant triggering by religion back to that time of my life.
Yeah. One of the things I was just going to add as you were talking is that there's really a dynamic in the Bible that you referenced very clearly about the Bible putting the blame on women. And it really, I think it's one of the things that shocks me more and more as I go on with how women are put in this frame of it's so much is your fault. But when you really look at the text, you mentioned the Tamar one, but even going back a little bit earlier, Adam and Eve in the garden, Adam was painted as like, I'm doing just fine. I'm having a grand old time naming the animals. Oh, what happens? Eve comes, but 5 verses later, bam, we're in trouble. And it's like it's crazy how that's framed. But when you step back from it and you think, all right, well, let's look at what happened there. They were basically like children. They were innocent in this story. And God, knowing that there's this serpent that can do so much damage, puts them in this garden. And then he says, basically, like, now that I've allowed this serpent in this garden, and I've told you to go play in my garden, knowing the serpent that can destroy your souls is right there. Now that he's actually done all this damage to you, I'm going to blame you. It's like that's classic framing. That's classic gaslighting. Same thing happens, what is it, Genesis 6 in the book of Enoch, where the watchers fall, the angels fall from heaven because they're so desperate to copulate with these beautiful human women. And again, like that ends up creating giants, which requires the flood. Like because women were so damn sexy that even the angels couldn't resist them, I had to flood the whole place and kill everybody. Like women are pretty powerful. And it's pretty crazy when you look at it and you think that dynamic mixed with patriarchy on steroids in this worldview, like how any woman in this day and age can raise her children, especially female children, to want that worldview to perpetuate is just beyond me. I truly shudder at it. Like, why would you want to say women are inferior, women are the problem, men are in charge of women? To say those kind of things is just, it staggers me that people still think that stuff has anything to do with reality.
Yeah, it's and the thing that gets like going the Adam and Eve story, the thing that I find so like mind-boggling about it is like the fruit. It's not just eating an apple, it's the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. It's the ability to understand right from wrong. And so she goes into this, she can't understand right and wrong, and so then she sins by trying to understand right and wrong. And the idea of being able to think for yourself and to reason for yourself and to parse out like where you're treating people badly, what morality is, that is sin. In the Bible, is what they say, like the sin, being good, being a good Christian is simply obeying. It's trust and obey. It's fear God and believe in him and believe that what he says is morality is morality. And as soon as you start saying, is this moral? Is this not moral? Then you're falling and you're fallen. And I do I kind of appreciate that looking back now as an atheist, being like, hey, good on Eve, like good on women for like trying to have some free thought and some think for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, it makes you think Eve was the heroine, and maybe if the whoever the serpent was, and if we think now it was in the theology devolved to be this is Satan, but maybe it was Lilith, Adam's first wife, who got booted because she was disobedient. Well, whoever the serpent was, like maybe the serpent was the hero too, because the serpent really did want to open their eyes. And it's like it's crazy the ways we take these things. I do want to ask, just in terms of the atheism part of it, when you did deconvert, how did people respond to you when you first started talking about it, especially your loved ones and your family, when you said this worldview is not reality? What was the reaction?
There was a lot of variety of reactions. I feel like looking back, I kind of regret that when I came out as an atheist, I put that alongside my story of abuse. And I guess I still kind of do that to some extent. And my story of being mistreated by the church, because that was also a very big play in my deconversion, was the way that I was treated by my new church community. And again, it was slut shaming. And uh, they were like, well, that's not what Christianity is. They're like, oh, but you just aren't understanding. You just had bad experiences with Christians. That's bad churches. That's religion. That's not your faith. You never truly, like, you just don't understand what God is like one common one. And it's like this tragedy of she's been pushed away by evil people within the church. And taking away the fact that I can think for myself. And I no longer believe, because I've also thought through it, and it was a lot of different factors in that, not just my abuse, but it was more the theology surrounding my abuse and the fact that the Bible, as much as I looked to the Bible for comfort and sometimes did get comfort out of the Bible, ultimately the amount of comfort there was strongly outweighed by the teachings about women. And so that was like a big question, the way that people were treated in the Bible. That was part of why, like, the rules, the idea that you can't be gay, that God can just make you gay and then you're damned to hell because you happen to be born gay, and that we would judge people for their sin, like being so judgmental and putting ourselves up as so superior, because we're Christian. It was realizing that things weren't true. I had like a big moment for me. It was like a small thing. And I think a lot of people that have deconverted, it's like these small things just can't comport. I studied economics, and I remember sitting in a sermon in my church at the time, and the pastor was talking about interest and usury. And usually, like, it's often interpreted as that usury is like payday loans, and it's like super high interest rates, and you're taking advantage of the poor. Is that so God doesn't like it when you take advantage of the poor. But then it's like the same word is used where in the parable where Jesus is talking about the three servants that are given money, and the one just buries it in the ground and holds it. And it's like, well, you didn't even put it in the bank. You didn't even like go and get interest. So it's like and it's like the same word. And so you realize that the Bible's actually saying like, no, you can't charge interest. And I remember being like, well, you can't have a functioning society without interest, and you can't have value. Like, if you don't have value and capital, like, it ain't gonna work. The economy doesn't function. I'm like, so if God can like misunderstand such a basic economic concept as the charging of interest, then what else has he gotten wrong? And so it was more for me. There was a lot more to it. There's a lot of factors in my deconversion. It wasn't just the fact that I was mistreated by the church and mistreated by people. I also did reason through it. I could have just, if I still believed it, I could have just walked away from religion and from the church and had my own spiritual beliefs. But ultimately, it was the spiritual beliefs themselves that were destroying me, as much as it was the church. So that was often the reaction I got was, oh, you just didn't understand Christianity.
It's amazing the way that they just constantly have to have some way to explain it, because it to them, like, they can't face the possibility that we're implying with our worldview that simply says Christianity simply isn't true. It's just not. It's mythology. And it's amazing to me that even when I was a Christian, I remember I don't think I ever once seriously said, is there any possibility, like, just even in the craziness of like let's make up hypotheticals and go crazy with it. Is it possible that Christianity is just completely made up and man-made, and there's nothing transcendent about it? I didn't ever really have that serious thought my entire life, and I think a lot of them never have, and it's just too frightening. The terror aspect of, like, if the implications of atheism are true, then I've lived my whole life for this mythology from ancient Canaan, and it's like they would rather cling to this ancient Canaanite demigod, Yahweh, and, knowing that the craziness of that whole story, that he used to be the son of Elyon and used to have brothers and sisters, and he used to have Asherah as his mother, and then they merged it, and then it was Yahweh and his Asherah, and then she gets taken away for some reason, probably because of the patriarchy. It's like, so all these bizarre things about the Yahweh character alone, and then how that evolves over the centuries, and then the Jesus character, and realizing, just when you realize what's going on in the Greco-Roman mystery cults of that 200 or 300 years before Christ. And when you look in the Gospels, you can clearly see that they're basing him on so many of the mythologies that are already in discussion, but they'd rather cling to this notion of like, but it's still true. This is the one true mythology, because otherwise they basically, like Paul says, you truly are of all men to be most pitied. You have wasted your life on a joke. It's just this whole thing's a joke, but it's
Yeah.
amazing to me. Like, I love how, I think you alluded to it earlier, the piece of it is so different. And I would echo what you'd said. I forget exactly how you put it, but I know for me, I was a Christian for over 40 years. And when I deconverted, I would say in that first hour, I had more peace just in that 1 hour than I had in the
Yeah.
last 40 years combined. So that whole verse about my yoke is easy, my burden is light, it's not true. It was
Yeah.
so beautiful. It's like, oh my gosh, there's a reason that all these splinters are in my mind and I haven't been able to get them out. There's a reason that this hasn't made sense. It's never going to make sense because this isn't real. And for me, I was literally in that last hour. It was like 4 years ago. I was sitting in front of my computer, and I was doing this little self-talk for an hour, saying, "Is it possible that this isn't real?" I was like, "No, there's no way." And the first thought that came into my mind was, "There's no way that we've all en masse, by millions and billions of us, have been deceived for 2,000 years. There's no way. Is there that many people could be deceived for 2,000 years? Is that even possible?" And I was like, "Well, we think that the Muslims are all deceived. We think the
Yeah.
Buddhists are all deceived. Like, why couldn't we be deceived?" And I was like, "Yeah, I guess it could be. It could be possible." And I started saying it like almost like a mantra to myself. Say it, Tim. Say the words. It's not real. And I mean, once I said it and like really meant it, I was like, "Holy shit! It's not real. It's never been real." And the peace that flooded in, I was like, "That's why none of these things make sense. That's why there's so much angst in my heart. That's why this whole shame game thing doesn't make sense. It's not real. It's not meant to make sense."
Yeah.
And I loved the freedom that came, was almost immediate. It was overwhelming. And I almost felt like laughing. I was like, "You gotta be freaking kidding me. I've been living for mythology for decades. Are you freaking kidding me? No way. No way."
Yeah.
I was like, "Yeah, you have been. Sorry, you've been a sucker. You're the sucker in the room." And I was like, wow. But I was so glad I escaped. Um,
Yeah.
Taking it back to your story, when you do get a chance to talk to your family, how do they respond to you at this point? Now that it's been a few years removed from that.
Uh, at this point, I think my parents have come to a point of acceptance. It's a bit of a grieving process for them. I was the first of my siblings to come out as an atheist, uh, and
The first and
both my
only, or the
sisters.
first of
First,
others?
there's three of us, and both of my sisters, neither of them believe. I don't know how much my middle sister is not. She's not the most like spiritual. Like she's not like that's not the way she's ever approached her faith. She just kind of lived and let lived and did her own thing. My youngest sister was like really into it and went to New St. Andrews, Doug Wilson's school afterwards, lived with church elders. She was the one that got the deepest into Christ Church. Because I had left after high school, and she just like really got into it. And I think the church in many ways came around her as like a form of crisis management. Because she knew what had happened. She was there for it. Nance had used her to groom me, and so they had kind of like, we got to keep her very brainwashed. And so she was stuck in it. And then COVID happened, and then she was able to, through COVID, distance herself and kind of get out.
So 3 out of 4 of you escaped Christianity?
3 out of 3. 3 out of 3
3 out
of
of
us
3.
left.
Wow. Praise the Lord.
Yeah.
That's
Yep.
awesome.
Praise the
Wow.
Lord. Praise Jesus.
So
So we've all gotten out, and it was hard on my parents. I think for me, when I made that post, that was rough for them. I was far away, and at that point I had moved to Australia. Part of my deconversion was moving to Australia. It allowed me to get away. I was in another controlling church that was also quite toxic. A Southern Baptist church in Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill Baptist Church. And they had threatened to put me on the care list and publicly shame me in front of the entire congregation because I'd had sex. And that was the catalyst for, I started asking the question, do I really need these people in my life? Because I felt like if I was to be publicly shamed like that, I didn't see how it would be possible for myself to ever show my face in church again. And it would destroy, I was like, it would destroy all my relationships, and I have to get away from it. And
publicly ashamed for having a beautiful relationship with another human being. That's amazing.
yeah, exactly.
Wow.
It was, yeah, precisely. And I had told, again, it was like in therapy, in church therapy, that I had told my counselor that I had had sex. And she had then shared that with the elders, and the elders had discussed it. And I was just shamed in front of the elders. I had to beg in tears not to have it announced, essentially, to the entire church congregation of 1,000 people.
Wow.
And so that was the point where I started asking, do I need these people? Do I need religion? And I was in this like interim of, do I need do I need, like, I still believed I needed God. And so that was the first question of, do I need the church? And I went away, I went to Europe, and I traveled around Europe and got some separation, and spent a lot of time journaling and exploring and living life and having good sex. And and that was kind of like, I came to the conclusion that I didn't want or need the church. And then it was a very quick follow on after that of, well, if I don't need the church, do I need God? And is God even real? Was kind of my slow process out. But I was the first. I think I've lost track of your original question about my family. I was the first, and my parents weren't able to really speak to me because I was in Australia. In order to avoid getting excommunicated, I had moved to Australia, and it had created this distance, so I didn't have to get publicly shamed. I was still afraid of that public shaming. I didn't want that to happen. And so that was, yeah.
That's an amazing ride. Can I ask just, I know I've kept you for a while, keep it to a few quick questions and we'll wrap up. With your parents, and, lump in there, any close loved ones, do they still believe, I assume, that you're going to burn in hell? And if you were to talk to them, do they kind of proselytize again, or just express concern that like your soul is in danger?
I've put some pretty hard boundaries on that. I did have a very genuine and honest conversation with my mother about that. And she struggles with that. And I think she's gone through this full grieving process. But for her now, it's more like our lives are going to be bad now because we don't believe in God. And she thinks that because like we're now making choices with our lives, like none of us are virgins anymore. We all drink alcohol. we do all these things. So she really struggles with that, and so sees us leaving as causing pain in the now and in the now world, which I would say is some progress. My father, I haven't talked to him as in depth about it, but he just wants us to be happy, and he's like, well, as long as they're happy and healthy and safe, and it's all good, I think is generally, they've come a long ways. The original shock and the devastation of having us leave has faded. I've had friends that have tried to proselytize, and I've had family members, like more distant family members, try to proselytize to me, and I put down a pretty hard wall. I am deconstructed. I am I am leaving. I cannot and I will not have a relationship with someone who is trying to convert me back to religion. I don't need that in my life.
Can I ask this? Do you think that they think through the implications of like the issue of loved ones that would say you are on your way to hell, and I certainly am.
Hmm.
The idea that the Christian person are going to a place where you're going to presumably have no more tears. You're going to dance before the Lord and rejoice. It's going to be all good. Like, how are you going to be rejoicing knowing your children are burning actively
Yeah.
forever? Like, how can you be happy? How can that be heaven? And to me, it's like the only way you could truly be happy there is if a part of your humanity, or arguably the most loving part of your humanity that is endeared to your children, is sort of sucked out of you, and you're kind of like
Yeah.
a shadow of a person. You're like a mirror, a robotic mirror of what a human is. But the part of you that feels pain and just wants to love one of your own children, it kind of has to die. It kind of has to, I mean, maybe they'd say, well, that's part of the glory process is you will hate sin so much and you'll understand the white hot holiness of God so much. And that eventually you'll just be like, anybody that's an enemy of God, even my own children and my own spouse, if you won't bow your knee to Christ, I will agree with God. You deserved what you got. Maybe they think that somehow that'll work out, but it's like at that point, you're like, you've lost your humanity. And I've said a lot on this channel,
Yeah.
when you believe monstrous things long enough, it kind of makes you into a monster. And the idea
Yeah.
of our own, my mom, our own parents being able to look at us and say, "You will burn forever, and I will dance before the Lord with no tears and just a smile on my
And
face
have
forever."
joy
Yeah,
in you burning.
yeah,
I think that's what the Bible
exactly.
says.
And I'll be okay
Yeah.
with that forever, forever and ever. It blows my mind. Do you think they think through it on that level at all?
I think that they have been forced to relinquish parts of their belief system in order to cope with that because and I haven't spoken recently or in depth with my family members about that, but I think that it's just it would be too much for them. They're good people ultimately is what it comes down to, and they haven't allowed that to infest them so much that they have gone to becoming basic psychopaths. Is in order to have that, like one of the things that I say I've said to Christians. I have a Christian friend who's like very much struggling in the work, so like working through her faith. Is even if God like could present himself in a way that all the evidence, he's like, if he's all powerful, he can do it. He can write in the sky, whatever. It's like I am the God of the Bible. This is my like, and we can't explain it by like, and explains it in a way that science can like say, yes, there's the evidence. Even if that is possible, I would never worship him because I cannot see that as being moral and good. And the idea that you would punish people for not liking you, essentially, and you would be this jealous God of, I will reject these people forever and force them to suffer for eternity because they don't want to be with me, or they don't want to believe in me, or they don't want to worship me. That's the theology of an abuser. And
Yeah.
yeah.
It's amazing the way that we don't see that. We even the songs are still going through my head of, God, you're this good father. And it's like, what person would be able to get away with saying, to his fiance, "Hey, sweetie, I want to love you, I want to marry you, I want to take good care of you, but if you don't love me back, I will beat the shit out of you." Like, what
Yeah.
girl's gonna want that guy? And like, what classic story do we have where the girl responds and says, "Hey, yes, I would love to marry you. I love you so much, but please don't hurt me." Like, I will love you back. Please don't hurt me. Like, that's not love. And yet we paint him as this good father. It blows my mind. But having said that, I know when I was in it, that's how I saw it. I saw it as like, when you look at the depths of your depravity, God basically pulled you out of sin, and you were a slave to your sin, you were a slave to your depravity, and He pulled you out of it. He's nothing but the rescuer. He's nothing but gracious and loving. And you look at it on this side of it, you're like, yeah, but he was pulling you out of the slavery thing that he created. He created this whole slavery thing. In this theology, he makes
Yeah.
you, he foreseeing everything. He makes you fallible, gaslights you, and frames you in the garden. Now you're condemned because you're a child of Adam, and now
Since the
having,
father.
yeah, it's like now, and it's like all of a sudden you're on the slave block. Like, well, who put you there? He could have changed this, and it's like this, like Dan Barker likes to talk about. It's like he's created, like what person's gonna want a doctor who's gonna cut you with a knife and then sell you the band-aid. It's like you're the one that's cutting me. I don't need your band-aid. I need you to just not cut me in the first place.
Yeah.
I do want to ask a couple of last quick questions. I'll fire these rapidly. Did it ever hit you, like, just the weirdness of what you used to believe? Like you used to, in the Eucharist, you and I used to pretend to be eating a dead man's body and drinking a dead man's blood. Like, does it ever weird you out what you used to believe?
I've had a couple of like funny moments where I've thought back and then realized that like I had just been assuming something because it's like I was taught it, like the idea that, well, because God made Eve out of Adam's rib, and my sister and I were chatting about this the other day. She's like, "Do you realize that men have the same number of ribs as women?" I was like, "What, really?" Because we all believed that obviously men would have less ribs because God had taken one and made Eve. And it's like I just believed this, and it didn't even like it seems so silly, and it's pretty funny now. Like I can now laugh at it. It's like, yeah, that's pretty embarrassing. It's embarrassing that I believe that. All the
Mm.
little rituals around it. It's pretty, yeah.
And circumcision, it was another one. When I got involved with
Oh,
that body book I told you about, it really I got involved in a whole bunch of little groups and people talking, and people were talking about how bad it is to circumcise. Like, don't circumcise your little boys. But I remember
yeah.
thinking, but God commanded it. And I was really at this angst of, like, I can see why we shouldn't do genital mutilation, but I can also see that God commanded it. But now looking back, I'm like, you believed in a God who believed in telling us to cut off the end of little boys' penises? Like, really? That's what you
How
believed in that?
messed up is that?
And the fact that I never questioned it once. It's crazy. Um,
It blows my mind that that's still accepted in Western society as a normal and okay thing. Like we're now,
yes.
thankfully, most of Western society, we go, okay, female genital mutilation is quite like, no, absolutely not. But it's just accepted and assumed that, yeah, you can mutilate a boy and that's fine.
Yeah, it's crazy. I
Freedom of
do
religion.
I do want to ask, before we wrap up, the afterlife. This is maybe I'll make this the last question unless something else pops in my mind at the last minute. Did you, when you were realizing you didn't believe this stuff anymore, that this was not reality, did it hurt you to think, maybe I don't go anywhere when I die? Did you expect to go somewhere? I assume, did you want to go somewhere? Did it hurt you to think, maybe there's nothing? Maybe I've got this one life, and when I take my last breath, that's it. How'd you
I
respond
was
to it all?
most I was mostly just relieved because I the idea of the afterlife, heaven didn't seem particularly good for me to me. It was like either I'm not good enough, either I God has rejected me and he's let all these terrible things happen to me, and I've clearly proven myself to be a sinner over and over again, even though I've prayed and asked for him to let me out, and I prayed to be no longer be abused. And that never happened. And I felt that so either I would go to hell, and I would be seen as I would, because I didn't make it essentially. So I had this fear of like, what if I think I'm a Christian and I actually am not, or I am a Christian and I'm going to heaven and I feel like it's been arbitrary. I just get to go to heaven, but all of these people that I love don't. It's like I had my roommates were a lovely lesbian couple, and I adored them, and they're the coolest people ever. And I was sitting there being like, my roommates, my like best friends, aren't gonna go to heaven. I had another best friend who was Mormon, and I was like, she's not gonna go to heaven. And so I felt like then it'd be like this undeserved thing. It was like I'm getting picked basically as a lottery ticket, just chance. Like I get to go, and then none of these people go. And I really struggled with the idea of heaven and feeling either that I would feel guilty that I had gotten into heaven, or that I would be condemned. And so there was a lot of fear around that. And like I'd have like survivor's guilt or something if I got into heaven. So once I stopped believing in an afterlife and it was like, this is just it was so freeing. It's like, I can just live for the now and I can focus on my world here. And I had been, for so much of the time, I'd been super suicidal. And I I really, really struggled with wanting to live through everything that happened with Nance. And I was like, well, at least then I'll know the answer for sure, whether I've made it. If I kill myself, then well, there's the answer. And I'll either go to heaven and it'll all be over and I won't have to worry about this anymore, or I'll go to hell and well, I guess I deserved it. And so stopping believing in heaven and hell allowed me to live my life in the now and actually have a life. I stopped living for something else, which was good.
Yeah, it's amazing how that worldview really does make you, as it were, live for the next life. Like it's almost like this life is practice in a sense, but it's certainly like a blink of an eye, and then the real life begins. And I was talking with several people recently about how it's actually, even though they would accuse us of nihilism, in many ways they're actually nihilistic because this one life that they've got here to them doesn't mean that much. Like it means enough where you do need to make your profession of faith, so you've kind of locked in your salvation. But in the biggest picture, if this is a blink of an eye and then eternity with the Lord is just forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, eventually it's going to just feel like this one little blink of an eye is just like a fading memory that you don't even think about anymore. You just think about the glories of what you're experiencing. In that worldview, this life means almost nothing to you. And it's truly nihilistic in that sense, where it's like, to us, this life means so much because we know this is the only life we've got. We want to make a beautiful life out of it, and we want to leave the world better than we found it, and we want to pass on to our, kids and so forth, to the culture, beautiful things, and to really make sure that we're loving people and helping people. But it's amazing to me the way that works, and you just, again, when you're in it, you just can't see it. It's crazy, and when you're out of it, you feel so bad. I say this both for the Christian worldview in general, but also for the Christ Church people. Like when you're outside of it and you're looking at it, it's like, oh my God, like what was I in? Like, what was I fucking in? I was in a cult. And you realize, just like a lot of people would call Christ Church a cult, and I think they're correct in saying so, you realize all versions of it were a cult, all of them. And to me, like any version of Christianity at this point is a cult. And I still sometimes think to myself, I can't believe that worldview suckered me that long. But I'm obviously glad I got some time back, as it were. But it really does give you the impetus to say, for the people that are willing to listen to reason, to say, let's have a conversation. Do you realize, for example, the mythology, do you realize that Dionysius turns water into wine? Dionysius rides into town on a donkey. Do you realize that Hermes walks on water, and so does Jesus? Do you realize that Helios, the sun god, wears a purple robe and has the crown of the sun rays, and then Jesus wears a purple robe and has a crown of thorns? Do you realize Zeus was crying tears of blood and water, and now Jesus cries tears of blood and water? Like, do you realize this stuff? Can we have a conversation about the mythology? And I don't know if you feel this compulsion, but I feel a real strong compulsion to say, I have to at least try. I know some people will not listen to reason, but like, especially when you're talking about kids, to admit this thing is psychological child abuse. And this worldview, like, you can't just sit back and say, well, do what you want. I don't care. It's like, you're abusing children.
Yeah. I would say, and I go as far as to say this, everything that happened to me with the sexual abuse is secondary to the spiritual abuse that happened by being a Christian. If I could take back one, and obviously they're so intrusive, I would say that the worst was Christianity and the Christian mindset, and it wasn't sexual abuse, as bad as the sexual abuse was.
Yeah, well said. It's amazing, amazing, amazing journey. Well, I know I've kept you for a long time, longer than I expected to. Did you have any final things you wanted to add before we wrap up that I didn't ask about yet?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot.
Yeah, we did. That was good. Well, I just wanted to wrap up then by saying thank you for your bravery, your openness, your honesty with all these things. I know this has been a hard journey for you, and I'm sure it's hard to go through it. I often think when I get through interviews that people probably need to go decompress for a while because some of these things are intense. They're intense topics. But I appreciate you being willing to share your story with us and to walk us through what happened, and also to share, just how the beautiful other side of it, because there's another side of it. I'm so glad that you're healing and making, taking something that was ugly and making it, making your story beautiful through it all.
Thank you. I appreciate what you're doing. I think one of the things that, having left, looking back, no one ever just said to me, like, that doesn't make any sense. I had people that weren't Christians in my life, and they were very respectful, and I appreciate that and I understand that. But as people that are ex-Christians, I think it's an opportunity to be like, no, I lived that, I get that. You can get out, and actually, no, that doesn't make any sense, and to maybe be a little bit more willing to step on those toes. Because I wish that someone had at some point told me that, well, that's pretty dumb, Emilie.
Yeah, ditto. Well, hopefully we can, I like to say, if I put 1,000 people in the kingdom, I'll take 100,000 back out. Hopefully a lot more.
Yes.
Anyway, well, thank you so much. I'll just wrap up by saying we've been speaking with Emilie Paige Dye. Emilie, thank you so much for what you're doing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for sharing your story today. It's been great to get to know you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.